Tonight, we're climbing into the cockpit of one of the most dangerous jobs humanity ever invented. And spoiler alert, you're going to black out, vomit into your own oxygen mask, and possibly die screaming at 900 miles per hour while your brain leaks out your nose. Forget Top Gun. Forget the leather jacket and the beach volleyball and the romantic sunset flights. We're talking about a profession where your body becomes a physics experiment gone horribly wrong. Where every single system in your meat suit rebels against the fundamental laws you're violating. And where the difference between being a hero and being a red smear inside a $30 million fireball comes down to whether you remember to clench your ass hard enough. You think you want to be a fighter pilot? You think you've got what it takes because you played some flight simulator and you can handle a little turbulence on your vacation to Cancun. Let me paint you a picture of your first day strapped into an F-16 Fighting Falcon, where the jet doesn't care about your dreams, your confidence, or the fact that you just spent 4 years at the Air Force Academy learning aerodynamics. The machine wants to kill you. The enemy wants to kill you. And here's the real kicker. Your own body wants to kill you, because you're about to do things that evolution specifically designed the human organism to absolutely not do. We're talking about sustained G-forces that'll make your vision tunnel into a pinpoint before everything goes black. About accelerations so violent that your internal organs shift position inside your torso. About altitudes where your blood will literally boil if your pressurization fails. And about maneuvers that'll snap your neck if you turn your head at the wrong moment. And that's just the flying part. We haven't even talked about the combat part, where someone's actively trying to turn you into airborne confetti with missiles that cost more than your childhood home and travel at speeds that make bullets look like they're standing still. So buckle up, or actually, let me be more specific. Strap yourself into a 5-point harness so tight it'll leave bruises on your collarbones. Pull on a helmet that weighs as much as a bowling ball and costs as much as a Mercedes. Breathe through a mask that'll make you feel like you're suffocating for the next 8 hours. And squeeze yourself into a seat that's specifically designed to be uncomfortable. Because comfort is the enemy of alertness when you're pulling 9 Gs and trying not to die. Your romantic notions about aviation are about to meet the screaming, vomiting, blacking out reality of modern air combat. And trust me, it's going to hurt in ways you didn't know were possible. If you'd like more stories like this one, please subscribe so you don't miss any new uploads. I'd also love to hear from you. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time of day you're tuning in. Let's start with 0500 hours. That's 5 in the morning for those of you who don't speak military time. And you're already awake because you've been awake since 0400 running through mental checklists while your stomach does backflips knowing what's coming. You're in the squadron ready room with 15 other pilots who look exactly like you. Same flight suit, same boots, same 1,000-yard stare that comes from knowing that, statistically speaking, one of you won't be doing this job in 5 years because you'll be dead or permanently disabled. The mission brief starts, and you're looking at satellite imagery of terrain that wants to kill you, weather patterns that want to kill you, and enemy positions that definitely want to kill you. Your flight lead, a major with 2,000 hours in type and a call sign that sounds ridiculous, but you'd never dare laugh at, walks you through the plan. You'll be flying as Viper 2, which means you're wingman, which means your entire job is to not screw up and get your flight lead killed while simultaneously not getting yourself killed. And oh, by the way, you might also need to engage enemy fighters and complete your ground attack mission. Simple, right? The brief covers communication protocols, tanker rendezvous points, rules of engagement, emergency procedures, and about 75 other things you're supposed to remember while you're pulling Gs and dodging missiles. Then comes the personal equipment room where you gear up. And this is where the reality really starts hitting. First goes on the G-suit, which is basically inflatable chaps that'll squeeze your legs and abdomen like a blood pressure cuff on steroids when you pull Gs, trying to keep the blood from draining out of your brain and into your lower body. It's uncomfortable when it's deflated. When it inflates during flight, it's like being grabbed by a giant fist that's trying to crush your intestines. Over that goes your survival vest, loaded with enough gear to survive behind enemy lines for 72 hours, including a radio, flares, first aid kit, and a pistol that'll be utterly useless against anyone with an actual weapon, but makes you feel slightly better. The vest alone weighs about 30 pounds. Then comes the torso harness that connects you to your parachute and your seat. Because in this job, your seat is also your escape pod, loaded with enough explosive charge to rocket you clear of the aircraft at 600 miles per hour, which will absolutely destroy your spine, but it beats the alternative. You're now wearing about 50 pounds of gear, and you haven't even gotten to the helmet yet. The helmet is a marvel of engineering and a torture device rolled into one. It weighs somewhere between 4 and 6 pounds, depending on the model, which doesn't sound like much until you realize you're going to be pulling 9 times the force of gravity, which means that helmet will effectively weigh 54 pounds, all of it, trying to snap your neck forward or backward depending on which direction you're pulling, Gs. Inside the helmet is the most sophisticated display system ever created, projecting critical flight data directly onto your visor so you never have to look down at instruments. Which sounds amazing until you realize it means there's literally no escape from the information. No break from the constant stream of speeds and altitudes and targeting data and warnings. The oxygen mask connects to the helmet with a satisfying but ominous click. And suddenly you're breathing through a rubber contraption that smells like disinfectant and previous pilots' fear sweat. Every breath requiring slightly more effort than normal, which your brain interprets as low-level suffocation even though you're getting plenty of oxygen. This is your face now for the next several hours. No scratching your nose. No wiping sweat from your eyes. No normal human face things. Just you and the mask and the constant awareness that this thin rubber membrane is the only thing standing between you and hypoxia at 40,000 feet. The walk to the aircraft is a waddle more than a walk because you're now carrying your body weight plus 70 pounds of equipment, and your legs are already tired before you've even started the real work. Ground crew snaps you a salute, which you return, and then you're doing the walk-around inspection, checking control surfaces and panels, and looking for anything that might kill you before the enemy gets a chance to. The F-16 is gorgeous in the way a great white shark is gorgeous, all purpose-built lethality and perfect engineering. But it's also a collection of 10,000 things that can fail catastrophically. You're checking for hydraulic leaks, loose panels, damaged ordnance, and anything else that looks wrong. While knowing that you're not an expert in half this stuff, and you're basically trusting that the crew chiefs who signed off on this bird know what they're doing. Then comes the ladder. And climbing into an F-16 cockpit while wearing all this gear is like trying to climb into a gym locker while wearing a refrigerator. The cockpit is tiny, claustrophobic, deliberately so. Every inch of space is occupied by switches, displays, or critical equipment. You lower yourself into the ACES-2 ejection seat, which is surprisingly uncomfortable because it's designed for function, not comfort. Designed to keep you in exactly the right position for ejection, even when you're pulling 9 Gs and your body wants to slump forward. The crew chief helps you connect everything: your oxygen hose, your communication lines, your G-suit inflation hose, and finally the 5-point harness that goes over your shoulders, between your legs, and clicks together at your chest with a fitting that could probably stop a bullet. The crew chief pulls the strap so tight you can barely breathe. Which is intentional, because loose straps at high Gs means your body moves around, which means injury or death. You give him a thumbs up even though you feel like you're being crushed by a mechanical octopus. And he climbs down and pulls the ladder away. The canopy comes down with a hydraulic whine, and suddenly you're sealed in. The world outside becomes muffled and distant. You are alone with a machine now. The instrument panel in front of you looks like someone took every warning light ever invented and crammed them into 3 square feet. There are over 200 switches and controls in this cockpit, and you need to know what every single one does, instantly, without looking. Because looking down in combat means not looking at the threat, which means dying. You start going through the startup checklist, flipping switches in sequence, watching systems come online. The heads-up display flickers to life on the windscreen in front of you, projecting flight data onto the glass so you can see it while looking outside. The multi-function displays on either side of the main panel illuminate with tactical information, system status, and weapons readiness. Everything's green, which means everything is working, which means you're running out of excuses not to do this. Tower comes through your headset with taxi clearance, and you advance the throttle slightly, feeling the jet's massive turbofan engine respond, pushing you forward with a force that's gentle now, but that can accelerate you from 0 to highway speeds in about 3 seconds when you really open it up. You steer with your feet on the rudder pedals, following the taxiway, and every bump and crack in the concrete transfers directly to your spine because this seat has exactly 0 cushioning. You reach the hold short line and go through your final checks. Flight controls moving freely. Hydraulic pressure good. Fuel quantity good. Weapons safe. Radar in standby. Engine instruments all in the green. You're checking things you've checked 3 times already because redundancy keeps you alive and complacency kills. Tower clears you onto the runway and you taxi into position, lining up on the center line. And this is it. This is the moment. Ahead of you is 8,000 feet of concrete. And beyond that is sky. And beyond that is someone who wants to shoot you down. Your right hand is on the stick, your left hand is on the throttle. And you're running through the final mental checklist while your heart tries to break through your rib cage. Tower clears you for takeoff, and you advance the throttle to military power, feeling the jet surge forward. And then you push the throttle past the detent into afterburner. The afterburner is not loud from inside the cockpit. It's beyond loud. It's a physical force that you feel in your chest cavity as the jet accelerates like it's been rear-ended by a freight train made of TNT. The acceleration pushes you back into the seat with enough force that lifting your arms feels like doing curls at the gym. And you're watching the airspeed indicator climb with terrifying speed. 60 knots, 80 knots, 100 knots, and at 120 knots you rotate, pulling back gently on the stick, and the nose comes up and the ground drops away and you're flying. Except you're not really flying yet. You're essentially controlled falling upward, using thrust to temporarily overcome gravity while maintaining just enough angle of attack to generate lift without stalling. And you're doing this while scanning instruments, listening to radio calls, raising the landing gear, raising the flaps, adjusting trim, and trying not to think about the fact that you're in a barely controlled explosion that's climbing at 4,000 feet per minute. The initial climb is nose high, and the visibility is terrible because you're looking mostly at sky, trusting your instruments to tell you if you're about to hit something, which is a weird thing to trust when your caveman brain is screaming that you should be able to see where you're going. You level off at Angels 20,000 feet and start your cruise out to the working area. And this is when you start to relax slightly, which is exactly when the G-suit decides to remind you it exists by giving you a test squeeze that feels like a blood pressure cuff designed by sadists. You're cruising at 0.85 Mach, which is about 600 miles per hour. And at this speed, the air rushing over the canopy creates a whistling scream that's always there, always present, a reminder that you're moving through a medium that will kill you instantly if this canopy fails. The tanker rendezvous happens at Angels 25,000 feet. And air-to-air refueling is one of those things that looks graceful and easy in videos, but is actually like trying to thread a needle while riding a mechanical bull in an earthquake. The KC-135 tanker is ahead of you, this massive 4-engine jet that makes your F-16 look like a mosquito, trailing a refueling boom that's swaying slightly in the turbulent air. You close in from behind and below, matching speed, and the boom operator in the tanker talks you in, directing you forward, a little left, a little right, steady. And you're trying to hold perfect formation while the boom descends toward the refueling receptacle just behind your cockpit. The boom makes contact with a metallic thunk you can feel through the airframe, locks in place, and fuel starts flowing, thousands of pounds of JP-8 jet fuel transferring from the tanker to your tanks while you maintain perfect formation at 500 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. And if you deviate more than a couple feet in any direction, the boom disconnects and you have to start over. And if you deviate too much in the wrong direction, you could collide with the tanker and kill everyone involved. You're holding the stick with micro movements, tiny adjustments, every muscle in your forearms tense, watching the tanker's underbelly inches from your canopy. And the boom operator finally calls out that you're topped off. The boom disconnects, and you drop away, filled with fuel and relief in equal measure. Now comes the actual mission, the reason you're up here. And your flight lead calls out that you're approaching the training area where you'll be practicing beyond visual range intercepts against adversary aircraft, which means you're about to find out if you can actually do this job or if you're just a very expensive passenger in a very expensive aircraft. The radar display in front of you shows a God's eye view of the battle space, with you at the center and various symbols representing other aircraft, your flight lead, your wingmen if you have any, and somewhere out there, the adversary. Your flight lead calls out contact, bearing 090 for 40 miles, which means there's an aircraft 90 degrees to your right at 40 nautical miles distance, and the training fight is on. You're going to intercept this target, identify it, and simulate shooting it down before it does the same to you. All while maintaining radio discipline, managing your fuel, and not flying into the ground, which is a surprisingly easy thing to do when you're focused on the radar and not the altitude. Your hands are moving constantly now. Right hand on the stick making small corrections to heading and altitude, left hand on the throttle adjusting speed and accessing the various controls mounted on the throttle itself. Controls that let you change radar modes, select weapons, and manage sensors without ever taking your hand off the throttle because taking your hand off the throttle in combat means dying. The target is maneuvering now. You can see it on radar, turning toward you, and this is going to be a head-on engagement, which means you're both screaming toward each other at a combined closing speed of over 1,000 miles per hour. And whoever shoots first wins. Except, you can't just shoot first, because there are rules of engagement and identification requirements, and you need to confirm this is actually an enemy before you fire. Which in real combat means getting close enough to visually identify or waiting for electronic confirmation. And in that time, the enemy could shoot you. Your flight lead calls out sorting the targets, deciding who's going to engage which aircraft. And you acknowledge with your call sign and confirm you're targeting the northern contact. The range is down to 20 miles now, 15 miles, 10 miles. And your radar warning receiver starts chirping because the adversary has locked you up with their radar, which means their weapons are looking at you. And you execute a defensive maneuver, braking hard left and down, pulling the stick back and left. And here come the G's. 4 G's, 5 G's, 6 G's, and suddenly your body weighs 6 times its normal weight. Every limb is made of lead. Your head is a bowling ball trying to rip off your neck. And you're doing the anti-G straining maneuver, tensing every muscle in your legs and abdomen, grunting out sharp exhales, trying to keep blood from draining out of your brain and into your lower body. Because if your brain runs out of oxygenated blood, you lose consciousness, and when you wake up, you're either in a smoking crater or you're not waking up at all. Your G-suit inflates with a crushing squeeze around your legs and gut, helping force blood back up toward your brain. And you're holding the G, maintaining the turn, and your vision is tunneling, going gray at the edges, and you ease off slightly, reducing the G load to 5 Gs, which is still crushing but sustainable. And you're completing the turn, coming back around toward the threat. The adversary is turning with you. This is a turning fight now, a dog fight. And it's going to come down to who can maintain the tighter turn without stalling or blacking out. You're at corner velocity, the speed at which your aircraft can generate maximum turn rate. And you're right at the edge of the performance envelope, pulling as many Gs as you can sustain without losing consciousness. And the stick is all the way back in your lap, and the aircraft is buffeting, shaking, the airframe protesting the abuse, and you can hear the stall warning tone in your headset. A beeping that tells you you're right on the edge of losing lift and tumbling out of the sky. You're looking over your shoulder, craning your neck against 6 times the force of gravity to keep sight of the adversary, and your neck muscles are screaming. And you see him, a gray speck against the sky, and he's in a turn too. And this is the eternal geometry of air combat. 2 aircraft turning, each trying to get behind the other, each trying to point their nose at the other long enough to get a firing solution. The fight continues for what feels like hours, but is actually about 90 seconds of the most intense physical and mental activity you've ever experienced. And you're starting to understand why fighter pilots have the highest rates of physical exhaustion injuries in the military. Your neck hurts from the helmet weight amplified by Gs. Your arms burn from constantly fighting the stick forces, which increase with speed and G loading. Your legs are cramping from the anti-G straining. You're sweating rivers inside your flight suit despite the cockpit environmental control system. And you're breathing like you just ran a marathon, sucking oxygen through the mask in great heaving gulps. And then you make a mistake. You fixate on the target, focusing entirely on trying to get your nose pointed at him. And you stop cross-checking your altitude, and your flight lead screams over the radio. 2. Check altitude. Check altitude. And you glance at your altimeter, and you're at 8,000 feet and descending, and you were supposed to stay above 10,000 feet floor for this exercise. And in real combat, that 2,000-foot mistake would have put you in range of ground-based air defenses, which would have killed you while you were busy focusing on the air threat. You level off, climbing back to safe altitude, and the adversary has used your distraction to extend away, breaking off the engagement, and your flight lead calls knock it off, ending the training scenario. You feel like you just got beaten up by an invisible attacker. Every muscle aches. Your brain is foggy from the repeated cycles of high G maneuvering and the adrenaline crash that follows. Your stomach is doing things that stomachs should not do, rolling and churning, and you're very aware of the vomit bag tucked into your G-suit leg pocket, though using it would mean breaking the seal on your oxygen mask, which is not recommended at altitude. The flight lead debriefs the engagement over the radio, pointing out what went right and what went catastrophically wrong. And you acknowledge your altitude deviation with your call sign, professional and calm. While internally, you're replaying the mistake over and over, knowing that in real combat, that mistake would have gotten you killed. But the mission isn't over. Not even close. You still need to do ground attack training, which means descending to low altitude and simulating dropping bombs on a target range. And low altitude flying is a completely different kind of dangerous. You descend from 20,000 feet to 500 feet above ground level, and suddenly everything is moving past you at terrifying speed. At high altitude, you can fly for minutes without the scenery changing much. At 500 feet doing 450 knots, the ground is a blur, and terrain features appear and disappear in seconds. And you're navigating by a combination of GPS, map reading, and desperately trying to remember landmarks from the brief. Because if you get lost at low altitude, you can easily fly into a hill or a tower or power lines that aren't on your chart. The target appears ahead, a cluster of white panels arranged in a specific pattern on a bombing range that's been used so many times, the earth around it is cratered like the moon. And you're setting up your attack run, configuring the weapons system, selecting the simulated munitions, designating the target, calculating the release point. And you're doing all of this while flying 100 miles per hour faster than a race car about 50 stories off the ground. The attack run requires you to fly straight and level for about 10 seconds, which doesn't sound like much until you realize that in combat, flying straight and level is how you die, because it makes you predictable, and predictable means targetable. You pickle off the simulated weapon, the system beeps to confirm release, and you immediately execute a brake turn, pulling hard to get off the attack axis, and the G's slam into you again, and your vision grays, and you're straining and grunting, and the ground is rotating around you at an impossible angle. Recovery to base is supposed to be the easy part, the wind down, the victory lap. Except there's no such thing as an easy part in a fighter aircraft. You're rejoining formation with your flight lead, tucking in close on his wing, close enough that you can see the rivets on his aircraft, and any closer would be insane. Maintaining perfect position relative to his jet while he maneuvers. And formation flying is exhausting in a completely different way from combat maneuvering, because it requires constant tiny corrections, constant vigilance, constant awareness of closure rates and angles. Because if you drift too close, you could have a mid-air collision at 500 miles per hour, which would vaporize both aircraft and everyone in them. The approach to base requires you to enter the traffic pattern at exactly the right point, at exactly the right altitude and speed, and execute a pitch-out maneuver that's simultaneously beautiful and terrifying. A hard descending turn that bleeds off speed while positioning you for landing. You roll inverted briefly, pulling through the turn, and the ground is above you and the sky is below you, and your inner ear is screaming that everything is wrong. And then you roll upright and you're on the downwind leg, parallel to the runway, but going the opposite direction. Running through your landing checklist. Landing gear down. 3 green lights confirming all 3 wheels are down and locked. Flaps down, airspeed on target. Fuel quantity checked. You roll into the turn to final approach, and you can see the runway ahead. A long strip of concrete that looks impossibly narrow from up here. And you're descending on the glide path, making corrections, fighting a slight crosswind. And the runway is getting closer, and the ground is coming up, and you're focused on the touchdown zone markers. That's where the wheels need to contact. Not before, not after, right there. And you're bleeding off speed. Back pressure on the stick to raise the nose slightly. Throttle coming back. And the main wheels kiss the runway with a chirp of rubber on concrete, and you're down. Rolling out, deploying the drag chute if you need it, or just using aerodynamic braking and wheel brakes. And you made it back alive, which is always a minor miracle. You taxi back to the D-arm area where weapons technicians will safe all your systems, then to the parking spot where the ground crew is waiting with chocks and chains. The canopy comes up and the outside world rushes back in, sound and heat and the smell of jet fuel and hot metal. And you're shutting down systems in sequence, watching the displays go dark one by one, and the engine spools down from a scream to a whine to silence. A crew chief climbs the ladder and helps you disconnect from the aircraft. Oxygen hose, comm lines, G-suit hose. And then you're releasing the harness, the shoulder straps coming off like the world's most uncomfortable backpack being removed. And you stand up on shaking legs, muscles that have been tensed for hours suddenly being asked to support your weight again. Climbing out of the cockpit is harder than climbing in because now you're exhausted and dehydrated, and your legs are uncertain, and you're still wearing 70 pounds of gear. You step onto the ladder and climb down, and when your boots hit the tarmac, it feels like returning to Earth from another planet. The ground crew asks how the jet performed, and you give them a thumbs up because the jet did fine. It was perfect, actually. It did everything you asked it to do, even when you asked it to do impossible things. You pull off your helmet, and the cool air hits your sweat-soaked hair, and it's the best feeling in the world. And you're walking back to the squadron building, carrying your helmet. And you feel like you've been beaten with hammers, but you also feel more alive than you've ever felt. The debrief is in 30 minutes, and you're using that time to chug water because you're dangerously dehydrated. You sweated out about 3 pounds of fluid during that flight, and your body is screaming for replacement. And you're also trying to eat something even though your stomach is still doing gymnastics. The debrief itself is humbling, which is a polite way of saying you're about to get systematically torn apart for every mistake you made. And in a 2-hour flight, you made dozens of them. The flight lead goes through the mission from takeoff to landing, using the data recorded from both aircraft to reconstruct every moment. And modern fighters record everything, every control input, every radar emission, every radio call, every weapon simulation, all of it preserved for analysis. Your altitude deviation during the dogfight is discussed in detail, not with anger, but with cold professional analysis of how that mistake happened, why it's dangerous, and how to prevent it. Your radio discipline, or lack thereof, is addressed. Your fuel management is questioned. Your weapons employment was technically correct, but tactically questionable for reasons that will take you months to fully understand. And this is just the training flight debrief. In actual combat, the debriefs last hours, sometimes days, as every aspect of the mission is analyzed, criticized, and documented. This is the part of fighter aviation that doesn't make it into the movies. The endless studying, the constant evaluation, the brutal honesty about performance. The knowledge that you are never good enough, and the moment you think you are is the moment you'll make a fatal mistake. After the debrief comes the paperwork, because even in the most high-tech aviation platform ever created, there is always paperwork, maintenance forms to be filled out, flight logs to be updated, training records to be signed. And then, if you're lucky, you get to go home. Except you don't really get to go home because you have to be back at 0400 tomorrow to do it all over again. The physical toll of this job is cumulative and devastating. Fighter pilots have chronic neck and back problems from the combination of helmet weight and G-forces, the equivalent of whiplash repeated hundreds of times. The hearing damage is permanent despite the best hearing protection, because you can't completely shield your inner ear from the sustained noise levels of a fighter cockpit. The dehydration is chronic because you can't drink enough before a flight without needing to urinate during the flight. And urinating in a fighter cockpit is technically possible with the piddle pack system, but it's complicated and embarrassing. And most pilots just accept being dehydrated. The exhaustion is bone deep, the kind that sleep doesn't fully fix. Because your body needs recovery time that you're not getting when you're flying 5 times a week. And we haven't even talked about night flying yet, which is everything we just described, except you can't see anything, and you're relying entirely on instruments and night vision equipment, or carrier operations if you're Navy, which adds the excitement of landing on a moving platform at night in bad weather, or air-to-air refueling at night, which is like the daytime version, except the tanker is just a set of lights in the darkness. And you're forming on lights, while the boom operator talks you into position you can barely see. The mission we just described, the one that left you exhausted and dehydrated and aching. That's a peacetime training mission. That's the easy version. In actual combat, people are trying to kill you with surface-to-air missiles that travel at Mach 3 and can pull 40 Gs, making them far more maneuverable than your aircraft. In actual combat, there are enemy fighters that are just as capable as yours, flown by pilots who trained just as hard as you did. In actual combat, there's the constant possibility of mechanical failure over hostile territory, which means ejecting into a war zone where you'll be captured if you're lucky and killed if you're not. Let's talk about what happens when things go wrong, because things go wrong constantly in fighter aviation. And the difference between dying and surviving often comes down to milliseconds of reaction time, and whether you trained enough to make the right decision when your conscious brain has shut down and your muscle memory takes over. Engine failure is always a possibility when you're strapping yourself to a 30,000-pound thrust turbofan that's spinning at 10,000 RPM and running at temperatures hot enough to melt steel. If the engine fails at altitude, you have options. You can try to restart it. You can glide to a suitable landing area. You have time to think and plan and execute. If the engine fails on takeoff, right after you rotate, when you're 500 feet off the ground and climbing, you have about 2 seconds to decide whether to try to land straight ahead on whatever terrain is in front of you or to eject. And both options might kill you. The ejection seat is your last resort and your best friend, and a violent mechanical system that will save your life while simultaneously destroying your body. The ACES II ejection seat uses explosive charges to rocket you and your seat out of the aircraft, at an acceleration that peaks around 14 Gs, except these are vertical Gs, straight up your spine, compressing your vertebrae. And the force is enough to cause compression fractures in your spine, even in a successful ejection. The seat separates from you at altitude, your parachute deploys automatically, and you drift down to whatever is below you, which might be friendly territory, or might be enemy territory, or might be ocean, or might be mountains. And you'll deal with that when you get there if you're conscious and not too injured from the ejection. Pilots who eject successfully often end their flying careers because of the spinal injuries, the back pain that never fully goes away, the compressed vertebrae that mean you're now half an inch shorter than you were before. And that's a successful ejection. Unsuccessful ejections happen when you're too low for the parachute to deploy, or when you're inverted and eject into the ground, or when the seat malfunctions, or when you're incapacitated and can't pull the handle. Mid-air collisions are rare but catastrophic, usually happening during formation flying or dogfighting, two aircraft occupying the same piece of sky at the same time. And at fighter jet speeds, there's no avoiding it. Once you're on a collision course, the closing rate is too high, the reaction time too short. Controlled flight into terrain, the polite term for flying into the ground, is one of the leading causes of fighter aircraft accidents, happening when pilots are focused on something else. When they're disoriented, when they're flying too low and don't have enough altitude to recover from a mistake, when they misjudge their altitude at night or in bad weather. GLOC, G-induced loss of consciousness, happens when the blood drains from your brain during high G maneuvering despite your anti-G straining, and you go from conscious to unconscious instantly. No warning, no gray out, just on-off. And when you wake up several seconds later, your aircraft is usually in an unusual attitude or a dive, and you have seconds to recover before you hit the ground. Spatial disorientation is your inner ear lying to you about which way is up, happening in clouds or at night when you have no visual references. And your body becomes absolutely convinced that you're flying level when you're actually in a bank, or that you're climbing when you're descending. And pilots who trust their instincts instead of their instruments die, because instruments don't get disoriented. Hypoxia, oxygen starvation, can happen if your oxygen system fails or if you're breathing too shallow because of G-forces or stress. And the insidious thing about hypoxia is that it makes you stupid before it makes you unconscious. You lose judgment and decision-making ability right when you need it most, and you might not even realize something is wrong until you wake up in a smoking hole or don't wake up at all. And then there's combat, actual combat, where all the training and all the procedures and all the briefings meet the chaos of people trying to kill each other at supersonic speeds. Modern air combat often happens beyond visual range, meaning you're shooting at targets you can't see with missiles that cost millions of dollars each, relying entirely on your radar and your identification systems to tell you that the radar return 40 miles away is definitely an enemy, and not a friendly aircraft or civilian airliner. Because shooting down the wrong aircraft is a career-ending, possibly war crime-level mistake. The AIM-120 AMRAAM, the primary beyond visual range missile in the U.S. inventory, is a fire-and-forget weapon, meaning you lock up the target, launch the missile, and it guides itself to the target using its own radar, leaving you free to maneuver or engage other targets. Except it's not that simple because the enemy has radar warning receivers that tell them they're being targeted, and they have countermeasures, chaff and flares and electronic jamming, and they have their own missiles and the beyond. visual range fight becomes a chess game played at Mach 1.5, where the pieces are trying to kill each other. If the fight goes visual, if you end up in a close-range dogfight, you're using the AIM-9 Sidewinder, a heat-seeking missile that locks onto the enemy's engine heat. And you're maneuvering to get into a position where you can point your nose at the enemy long enough to get a good tone. That distinctive growl in your headset that tells you the missile's seeker head has locked onto the target's heat signature. And the enemy is doing the same thing, trying to get behind you, trying to get into your vulnerable 6 o'clock position where you can't see them and can't defend. And this is where all those hours of training in high-G maneuvering pay off or don't. The gun is your last resort. A 20mm rotary cannon with about 500 rounds. And gun kills in modern air combat are rare because getting close enough to use the gun means you're close enough for the enemy to use their gun. And gunfights are usually mutual suicide pacts, where both aircraft end up damaged or destroyed. And all of this is happening while you're managing fuel, because your aircraft burns fuel at an absolutely terrifying rate when you're in full afterburner. And running out of fuel over hostile territory or over water is a death sentence. You're monitoring your radar warning receiver constantly, listening for the tones that tell you you're being tracked or targeted or that a missile has been launched at you. You're maintaining radio communication with your wingman, with your flight lead, with the AWACS aircraft providing command and control, with the tanker you'll need to hit on the way home, with search and rescue forces that will come looking for you if you go down. You're fighting a multi-dimensional battle in three-dimensional space, keeping track of threats and friendlies, managing weapons and fuel, flying the aircraft, and making life or death decisions in seconds while pulling G's that make it hard to think. This is what you trained for. This is what all the suffering was for. And when you survive, when you make it back to base with empty weapons, pylons, and low fuel, and your heart still hammering in your chest, you'll do it all over again tomorrow. Because this is the job. This is what you signed up for, even if you didn't fully understand what you were signing up for. This is being a fighter pilot, not the Hollywood version with the cool sunglasses and the casual confidence, but the real version with the chronic injuries and the fear you learn to manage, and the knowledge that every single flight could be your last. So when someone asks if you'd survive a day as a fighter jet pilot, the answer is maybe, if you're lucky, if you're good, if nothing goes wrong, if the enemy makes mistakes, if your training holds up under the stress, if your body can handle the punishment, if your mind can process the chaos, if you can make the right decisions in impossible situations, and if you can do all of that while your brain is oxygen-starved and your vision is tunneling and your body is screaming that this is not what humans are supposed to do. Most people couldn't survive the training. Most of the people who survive the training wash out before they become combat ready. And the ones who make it, the ones who earn their wings and their call signs and their place in the squadron, they pay for it with their bodies and their relationships and sometimes their lives. Because this job doesn't just demand excellence, it demands sacrifice. And the price is higher than you can imagine, until you're the one paying it. Now let's rewind and talk about how you even get to the point where you're trusted with a $50 million fighter jet. Because the pipeline to becoming a fighter pilot is designed to break you, to weed out anyone who doesn't have the exact combination of intelligence, physical ability, mental toughness, and honestly, a certain amount of insanity required to do this job. It starts with officer training school or the Air Force Academy. Months of being physically and mentally tested, of proving you can lead and follow orders and handle stress, and this is before you even touch an aircraft. Then comes initial flight training, where you learn to fly in a Cessna or a Diamond, basic civilian-style aircraft. Learning the fundamentals of aerodynamics and flight controls and navigation. And even here, people wash out, because some people discover they get airsick every single flight and it never gets better. Or they can't handle the spatial reasoning required. Or they freeze up when things go wrong. If you make it through initial flight training, you move to primary flight training in the T6 Texan II, a turboprop trainer that's significantly more complex and powerful. And here's where the real pressure starts, because you're being evaluated on every single flight, graded on your performance. And if you get too many below average grades, you're washed out, sent to fly cargo or tankers or out of aviation entirely. The T6 introduces you to aerobatics, to formation flying, to instrument flight where you're in the clouds with zero visibility relying entirely on your instruments, and to navigation missions where you're flying low-level routes while managing checkpoints and timing and fuel. Every flight has specific objectives you must meet, specific maneuvers you must perform to standard, and the instructors are not there to be your friend. They're there to determine if you have what it takes, and most students don't. The washout rate varies, but it's consistently brutal. Somewhere between 30 and 40% of students who start flight training don't finish it, eliminated for various reasons ranging from airsickness to poor academic performance, to simply not being able to handle the pressure. If you survive primary, you move to advanced flight training. And here's where you track into fighters, bombers, cargo, or other specialties. And getting a fighter track is competitive, based on your class ranking and performance and needs of the Air Force. And not everyone who wants fighters gets them. The fighter track means you're going to the T-38 Talon, a supersonic jet trainer that's been around since the 1960s, but is still perfectly capable of killing you if you make mistakes. The T-38 is where you learn to fly in formation just feet from another aircraft, where you learn basic fighter maneuvers, where you get your first taste of high G flight and discover whether your body can handle it or whether you're going to be one of the unfortunate few who simply cannot adapt to sustained G-forces no matter how hard they try. Some people, through no fault of their own, have cardiovascular systems that can't maintain blood pressure to the brain during high G maneuvering. And these people wash out of fighters even if they're perfect in every other way. You're flying multiple times per day, studying late into the night, taking tests on systems and procedures and emergency protocols, getting maybe 5 hours of sleep, and doing it all again the next day for months. The academic portion is college-level engineering and physics, understanding aerodynamics and propulsion and aircraft systems in detail, because you need to understand why the aircraft does what it does, not just how to make it do it. You're memorizing emergency procedures because when something goes wrong at 400 knots, you don't have time to look it up. You need to execute the correct procedure immediately from memory. There are written tests, simulator tests, and flight tests. And failing any of them puts you on probation or washes you out entirely. After you earn your wings, after you graduate from flight training, you're still not a fighter pilot. You're a pilot who's going to fly fighters, which is a critical distinction. You get assigned to an aircraft type, let's say the F-16, and you report to your fighter training unit. And now begins the process of learning to actually employ the aircraft as a weapon system. The Fighter Training Unit course is months of the most intense training you've experienced yet. Learning every system on the aircraft in exhaustive detail. Learning how to employ every weapon. Learning tactics and techniques and procedures for every mission type, from air-to-air combat to close air support to strike missions against ground targets. You're flying multiple times per week, sometimes multiple times per day, building up hours and experience. And every flight is a test. Every flight is evaluated. And the standards are impossibly high, because the consequence of not meeting standards is dying in combat. You learn basic fighter maneuvers, 1-versus-1 engagements where you and an instructor pilot fight each other in training scenarios. And you will lose almost every single engagement for months, because the instructor has thousands of hours of experience and knows every trick, and you're still learning which switch does what. You learn defensive counter-air, how to survive when someone is trying to shoot you down, the specific maneuvers and energy management required to defeat a missile or outturn an enemy fighter. You learn offensive counter-air, how to prosecute a target, how to sort multiple adversaries and engage them in sequence, how to work with your wingman to create tactical advantages. You learn air-to-ground employment, how to find targets from 30,000 feet, how to employ precision-guided munitions and unguided weapons, how to calculate dive angles and release points, how to survive in the surface-to-air threat environment. You learn close air support, working directly with troops on the ground, providing air power to support ground forces in contact with the enemy. And this is some of the most stressful flying you'll do, because you're operating in close proximity to friendly forces, and the margin for error is 0. Because an error means killing the people you're trying to help. You fly night missions, learning to operate when you can't see anything outside the cockpit, relying on night vision goggles that turn the world into a grainy, green-tinted image with no depth perception. You fly in bad weather, in clouds and rain and turbulence, learning to trust your instruments when your body is screaming at you that the instruments are wrong. You fly in formation, 2-ship and 4-ship formations, learning to operate as part of a team where everyone's survival depends on everyone else doing their job correctly. You learn air-to-air refueling, plugging into a tanker at night in bad weather, because you'll need to do that in combat, and it doesn't get easier. The academics continue. Learning threat systems, learning what the enemy's surface-to-air missiles can do, what their fighters can do. Learning to recognize them on radar, learning their capabilities and limitations. You study tactics developed over decades of air combat, techniques that have been proven in actual war. And you learn why certain things work and why certain things get you killed. You memorize the rules of engagement for various scenarios, the legal and tactical constraints on when you can and cannot employ weapons, because using weapons incorrectly in combat can start international incidents or worse. The psychological pressure is immense and constant. You're constantly being evaluated, constantly compared to your peers, constantly aware that you're in competition for the limited slots at operational squadrons. And the pilots who perform best get the best assignments, while those who perform poorly get sent to less desirable locations or less desirable missions. Eventually, after months of training, after hundreds of hours in the aircraft, after passing every test and evaluation, you graduate from the Fighter Training Unit, and you receive your assignment to an operational squadron. And this is where your real career begins. You show up as the new guy, the FNG in squadron parlance. And despite all your training, you know almost nothing compared to the experienced pilots in the squadron who have actual combat experience, who have deployed multiple times, who have seen things you've only simulated. The squadron culture is unique and specific, a combination of professional excellence and dark humor, where people trust each other with their lives, but also mock each other mercilessly. Where call signs are usually embarrassing and based on some mistake or incident you'd rather forget. Your call sign is not something cool you choose for yourself. It's something the squadron gives you, usually after you do something stupid or embarrassing, and you're stuck with it for your entire career. The squadron operates on a cycle of training and deployment, preparing for months and then deploying to combat zones for months. And the training is designed to be harder than combat, so the combat feels routine. You participate in red flag exercises at Nellis Air Force Base, massive training exercises involving hundreds of aircraft and thousands of personnel, simulating full-scale air campaigns against highly capable adversaries. And these exercises are as close to real combat as you can get without people actually dying. Though people have died in red flag, because even training at this level is dangerous. You deploy to various locations around the world, to bases in the Middle East, to Europe, to Asia, wherever the United States has interests and commitments. And you sit alert, ready to launch within minutes if something happens, sitting in a trailer or a ready room with your gear on, trying to stay awake and alert during 12-hour shifts of absolutely nothing happening, punctuated by moments of sheer terror. When something does happen, the deployments are hard on everything, hard on your body from the continuous operations and the stress and the heat and the bad food and the lack of sleep, hard on your mind from the constant alertness and the knowledge that you might be called to actually employ weapons against actual people, hard on your relationships because you're gone for months at a time and your family or partner is dealing with everything at home alone and you're communicating through delayed video calls that only emphasize how far apart you are. You miss birthdays and anniversaries and holidays and your kids' school events, and you tell yourself it's worth it, that you're serving something larger than yourself, that you're defending your country. And some days you believe it, and some days you wonder if you made a terrible mistake. The actual combat missions, when they happen, are often anticlimactic, hours of flying to deliver weapons against targets that don't shoot back, against enemy forces that are so outmatched by American technology and training that they don't even try to fight. But sometimes the missions are terrifying. Flying through surface-to-air missile threats, watching missiles launch from the ground and tracking toward you, executing defensive maneuvers, deploying countermeasures, praying that the chaff or flares or electronic jamming defeats the missile. And sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't, and you lose friends, people you flew with yesterday who don't come back today. And you go to the memorial service, and you listen to the eulogy, and you see the boots and helmet and rifle display, and you know, it could just as easily be your memorial. And then you fly the next mission, because that's the job. The physical degradation continues and accelerates throughout your career. By your mid-30s, even if you've only been flying fighters for 10 years, your body shows the accumulated damage. Your neck has permanent issues, chronic pain from the repetitive whiplash effect of high-G maneuvering while wearing a heavy helmet. And you probably had several neck procedures or surgeries, epidural injections, physical therapy. And you know you'll have neck problems for the rest of your life. Your spine is compressed from thousands of hours sitting in an ejection seat and pulling G's, and just the accumulated effect of gravity on a spine that's carrying extra weight on your head and shoulders. Your hearing is damaged despite wearing the best hearing protection available, because you can't completely protect your inner ear from sustained exposure to cockpit noise levels. And you've got tinnitus, a constant ringing in your ears that never stops. That's there when you try to sleep. That's there forever. Your vision may be degraded from the eye strain of constantly focusing between cockpit instruments and distant targets. From the pressure changes of altitude, from the general abuse your eyes take. You probably have joint problems in your shoulders and elbows from fighting the control forces, from the repetitive motions, from the positions you have to hold during long flights. You might have gastrointestinal issues from the chronic dehydration, from the stress, from the irregular eating patterns. Your sleep is probably disrupted, partly from the shift work of alert duty and deployments, partly from the stress and adrenaline that doesn't wear off quickly, partly from the memories of friends who died, of missions that went wrong, of near misses that could have killed you. The divorce rate among fighter pilots is significantly higher than the general population, because the job demands everything and leaves little for relationships, because you're gone constantly, because when you are home, you're exhausted or preoccupied, because the stress affects your mood and your patience, because your spouse or partner didn't sign up to be a single parent, but that's effectively what they are for large portions of the year. The substance abuse rates are higher too. Pilots self-medicating for pain or stress or sleep problems because the official medical system is feared, because admitting certain problems means getting grounded, which means losing your career, which means losing your identity. So pilots hide injuries and problems and manage them unofficially until they can't anymore. The mental health challenges are real and often unaddressed. Post-traumatic stress from combat experiences, from losing friends, from near-death experiences, from the accumulated stress of years of high-stakes operations. But the military aviation culture has traditionally viewed mental health issues as weakness, as disqualifying. So pilots don't seek help, don't admit struggles, maintain the facade of invulnerability until they can't. The career path demands constant movement, new assignments every few years, uprooting your family repeatedly, move into new bases in new states or new countries, your kids changing schools constantly, your spouse trying to maintain a career despite relocating every 2 to 3 years. And each move is disruptive and stressful and hard on everyone. You make it to major, maybe lieutenant colonel if you're successful, and you have decisions to make about whether to stay in and move into staff positions, flying desks instead of aircraft, or whether to separate and try to transition to civilian life. Some pilots transition to the airlines, trading the excitement and danger of fighters for the monotony and safety of commercial aviation, flying the same routes over and over, following procedures, being glorified bus drivers in the sky, and some of them love it because it's stable and safe and pays well. And some of them hate it because they miss the challenge and the camaraderie and the sense of purpose. Let's talk about what happens in actual war, not training exercises with rules and safety observers, but real war where people are trying to kill you with weapons that don't care about Geneva Conventions or rules of engagement. The Gulf War in 1991 was the first major test of modern American fighter tactics and technology, and it was devastatingly effective. But it was also terrifying for the pilots involved, who didn't know going in whether Iraq's air defenses would be as capable as feared. The opening night missions into Baghdad were flown through the most heavily defended airspace on Earth at the time. More surface-to-air missiles per square mile than even Hanoi during Vietnam. And pilots flew through a sky lit up with anti-aircraft fire and missile launches, the entire city shooting at them. And they had to maintain their formations and hit their targets, not think about the fact that several of them were probably going to die. Some did die, shot down by surface-to-air missiles, captured by the Iraqis, and the images of captured American pilots on Iraqi television, beaten and coerced into making propaganda statements, reminded everyone that this wasn't a video game. The air war in Kosovo in 1999 was supposed to last a few days and lasted 78 days. And it included the humiliation of an F-117 stealth fighter being shot down by a relatively primitive SAM system because the Serbs got lucky or clever or both, proving that stealth isn't invincibility. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq that started after September 11, 2001 continue to various degrees today. And fighter pilots have been flying combat missions continuously for over 2 decades now. Close air support missions in Afghanistan supporting troops in contact, strike missions in Iraq and Syria against insurgents and terrorists. And the missions have been mostly one-sided because the enemy doesn't have an air force or sophisticated air defenses. But that doesn't mean they're safe. Just that the danger comes from ground fire and mechanical failures and the accumulated fatigue of repeated deployments rather than from enemy fighters. Libya in 2011, Syria in multiple operations over multiple years, various classified missions in various locations that will be declassified decades from now, if ever. Fighter pilots operating in the shadows, conducting strikes that are never acknowledged, supporting operations that officially don't exist. And there's the constant training for the war that might come. The war against a near-peer adversary, against China or Russia, against an enemy that has 5th-generation fighters and advanced air defense systems and cyber capabilities and anti-satellite weapons. A war where American air dominance isn't guaranteed, where pilots might face enemies as capable as they are, where the losses could be catastrophic. The scenario planning for a war with China over Taiwan involves hundreds of American aircraft losses in the first weeks, thousands of casualties, a level of attrition that the United States hasn't experienced since World War II. And fighter pilots know this. They study these scenarios. They train for these missions, knowing that if this war happens, many of them won't survive it. The mental calculation you make as a fighter pilot is complex and not entirely rational. You know the statistics. You know that in peacetime training, about 1 aircraft is lost for every 100,000 flight hours. And you know what that means over a career. You know that in combat against a near-peer adversary, the loss rates could be 10 or 20 times higher. You know that ejection, even successful ejection, probably ends your flying career and definitely damages your body. You know all of this, and you do it anyway. Because there's something in you that needs this, that thrives on this, that can't imagine doing anything else despite knowing the costs. The evolution of fighter aircraft tells you everything you need to know about how insane this job has become. The first fighter pilots in World War I were flying biplanes made of wood and fabric that topped out at about 90 miles per hour. And they were fighting each other with pistols and rifles before someone thought to mount a machine gun. And even then, the job was incredibly dangerous, with pilots dying from mechanical failures and mid-air collisions and enemy fire, and getting lost and running out of fuel. World War II fighters could reach 400 miles per hour, and the G-forces from turning at that speed were enough to cause blackouts. And the job became about managing energy and position. And tens of thousands of fighter pilots died in that war, shot down, crashed, lost over the ocean, burned alive in fuel fires. The jet age brought speeds above 500 miles per hour and then above the speed of sound. And the G-forces increased proportionally. And the pilots needed pressure suits and better oxygen systems and ejection seats, because bailing out manually at those speeds would tear you apart. The Vietnam War introduced missiles and radar and electronic warfare. And suddenly, you were fighting enemies you couldn't see, trusting technology to tell you what was real. And American pilots learned hard lessons about the limitations of their aircraft and weapons when they faced North Vietnamese MiG pilots who were well-trained and tactically proficient. The 1970s and 80s brought the FE-15 and FE-16, aircraft that could pull 9G sustained, that could fight beyond visual range or in close-in dogfights, that were so capable that the limiting factor became the human pilot, because the aircraft could handle maneuvers that would kill the pilot. The F-22 and F-35 represent the current state of the art, fifth-generation fighters with stealth and sensor fusion and capabilities that would seem like science fiction to a World War II pilot. But they still require human pilots who still pull the same brutal G-forces, who still face the same physical and mental challenges, who still die when things go wrong. There's constant discussion about whether the future of air combat is unmanned, whether we should replace human pilots with AI and remote operators, whether we can build autonomous systems that make kill decisions without humans in the loop. And the technology is advancing rapidly. But as of now, the most capable air combat platform is still a highly trained human pilot in a highly capable aircraft, because humans can adapt and improvise and make judgment calls in ways that current AI cannot. But that might change, and there might come a day when fighter pilots are obsolete, when the job you've sacrificed everything for is automated away. And honestly, that might not be a bad thing, because this job destroys people. The final question you have to ask yourself is why anyone does this job knowing what it costs, and the answer is complicated and personal and different for every pilot. But there are some common threads. There's the pure love of flying, of controlling a machine at the edge of its performance envelope, of doing things that seem impossible. There's the sense of purpose, of serving something larger than yourself, of being part of a warrior tradition that goes back thousands of years. There's the camaraderie, the bonds you form with people who understand what you're going through because they're going through it too. Relationships forged in shared hardship and danger. There's the identity. Being a fighter pilot is not just what you do. It becomes who you are. And giving it up means losing a fundamental part of yourself. There's the adrenaline, the biochemical addiction to the stress and the danger, the high you get from surviving something that could have killed you. And there's something deeper, harder to articulate, a need to test yourself against the ultimate challenges, to find out what you're capable of, to push past limits you didn't know you had. There's a specific kind of mission that represents the absolute peak of difficulty and danger in fighter aviation. And that's CEAD, suppression of enemy air defenses, pronounced SEAD, also known as wild weasel missions, where your job is to deliberately draw fire from enemy surface-to-air missile systems so you can locate them and destroy them. Let me be clear about what this means. You are flying into heavily defended airspace with the specific intention of making yourself a target, of getting enemy radar systems to lock onto you and track you and launch missiles at you, because once they light up their radars, you can locate them and kill them with anti-radiation missiles that home in on the radar emissions. This is not a mission where you're trying to avoid being shot at. This is a mission where you're trying to get shot at in a controlled way that lets you shoot back effectively. The F-16 CJ variant and F-15E Strike Eagle are often used for these missions. Loaded with AGM-88 HARM missiles, high-speed anti-radiation missiles, weapons that can detect and home in on enemy radar emissions from dozens of miles away, traveling at Mach 2, destroying the radar site before the enemy can shut down their system. The mission profile involves flying at medium altitude, making yourself visible to enemy radar, monitoring your radar warning receiver for indications that you're being tracked or targeted. And when you detect a radar emission, you launch the HARM, which follows the radar signal back to its source and destroys it with a high explosive warhead. Except the enemy knows this tactic, so they use techniques to counter it, turning radars on and off intermittently, using decoy emitters, positioning their systems in hardened bunkers, integrating optical tracking systems that don't emit radar, and layering their defenses so that if you're focusing on one threat, you're vulnerable to another. The SA-10, SA-20, and S-300 and S-400 systems used by Russia and exported to various countries are sophisticated and deadly, with the ability to track multiple targets simultaneously, engage aircraft at ranges exceeding 100 miles, and use tactics specifically designed to defeat Western countermeasures. Flying a CAD mission against modern integrated air defense systems is a chess game where the pieces are trying to kill each other, where every move has a counter move, where success requires perfect coordination between multiple aircraft, perfect timing, perfect execution, and a lot of luck. You're monitoring multiple threats simultaneously. Your radar warning receiver is going crazy with different tones indicating different threats. You're launching countermeasures. You're maneuvering to defeat missile shots. You're employing weapons. You're communicating with other aircraft. And you're doing all of this while pulling Gs and fighting the aircraft and managing fuel and trying not to fly into the ground. The stress level is astronomical because the consequence of a mistake is immediate and fatal. A surface-to-air missile traveling at Mach 3 gives you about 6 seconds from launch to impact at close range, 6 seconds to detect the launch, identify the threat, execute the appropriate defensive maneuver, deploy countermeasures, and pray. Some missiles can't be defeated by maneuvering because they can pull more Gs than your aircraft. So your only defense is electronic countermeasures or chaff or flares or terrain masking, hiding behind hills or buildings, using the Earth itself as a shield. The modern battlefield has become so saturated with sensors and weapons that the idea of traditional air superiority, of fighters flying freely over enemy territory, might be obsolete in a conflict against a sophisticated enemy. The future of air combat might involve standoff weapons launched from hundreds of miles away, hypersonic missiles that travel at Mach 5 or faster, directed energy weapons, lasers and microwave systems that can disable aircraft without physically destroying them, cyber weapons that can hack into aircraft systems and cause malfunctions, and the electromagnetic spectrum becoming a domain of warfare as important as the physical domains of air and ground and sea. The personal cost of this career extends far beyond the physical damage and the time away from home. There's a psychological and emotional toll that's harder to quantify, but just as real. You develop a relationship with death that's unlike what most people experience. A casual familiarity with mortality that comes from regularly doing things that could kill you. You know pilots who have died. You've been to their memorials. You've seen their names added to memorial walls. And you process this by accepting it as part of the job. By developing dark humor about it. By maintaining emotional distance. Because getting too close to the reality of it would make it impossible to continue. You make decisions that could result in your death or someone else's death. And you have to be comfortable with that level of responsibility. With the knowledge that your actions have consequences that can't be undone. You operate in a world where mistakes are often fatal. Where there's no second place in air combat. Where you win or you die. And this creates a perfectionist mindset that's useful in the cockpit, but destructive outside of it. Because you can't turn it off. You can't accept failure or imperfection in any area of your life. And this affects your relationships and your mental health and your ability to relax. The transition out of fighter aviation, whether it's into staff jobs or retirement or civilian life, is difficult for almost everyone because your identity is so wrapped up in being a fighter pilot that losing that identity feels like losing yourself. The skills that made you successful as a fighter pilot, the aggression, the competitiveness, the confidence bordering on arrogance, the comfort with high-stress situations, these skills don't necessarily translate well to civilian life or to normal human relationships. You've spent years in an environment where clear hierarchy and direct communication and immediate action are valued. And civilian workplaces with their politics and ambiguity and slow decision-making processes can be frustrating and alienating. You've experienced levels of intensity and purpose that civilian life rarely provides. And normal life can feel boring and meaningless by comparison, like you've peaked in your 20s or 30s, and everything after is decline and tedium. Some pilots thrive after leaving fighter aviation. They transition successfully to airlines or defense contractors or other careers. They rebuild their relationships. They find new sources of purpose and identity. But many struggle, dealing with depression or substance abuse or relationship failures or a persistent sense that they should have stayed in, that they quit too early, that their best days are behind them. The physical issues follow you for life. The chronic pain, the hearing loss, the vision problems, the joint issues. And you're dealing with these in your 40s and 50s, ages where many people are still healthy and active. But your body is broken in ways that are permanent and progressive. The Department of Veterans Affairs has specific disability ratings for the various injuries that fighter pilots sustain. Neck problems and back problems and hearing loss are so common that they're expected, compensated for, acknowledged as inevitable consequences of the career. There's no avoiding the calculation that you sacrificed your health and your relationships, and possibly your mental well-being for this career. And whether it was worth it is a question that different people answer differently at different times in their lives. In the moment, while you're doing it, it usually feels worth it. The intensity and the challenge and the camaraderie and the sense of purpose overwhelm the costs. But later, when you're dealing with chronic pain or divorce or estrangement from your kids or PTSD or the accumulated consequences of decades of stress, the calculation might change. and you might wonder if you made the right choice. If there was another path you could have taken, if the glory was worth the price. Let's address the elephant in the room, which is that despite everything we've discussed, despite the physical destruction and the psychological toll and the relationship damage and the constant danger, fighter pilots are overwhelmingly positive about their career choice. If you ask them if they do it again, knowing what they know now, most say yes, without hesitation. There's something about this experience that's so powerful, so transformative, so fundamentally rewarding that it justifies the costs in the minds of those who've lived it. Part of this is selection bias. The people who become fighter pilots are already the type who seek challenge and danger, who are comfortable with risk, who need intensity and purpose. So of course, they're going to value an experience that provides those things. Part of it is the sunk cost fallacy. You've invested so much, sacrificed so much, that admitting it wasn't worth it would be psychologically devastating. So you convince yourself it was worth it. But part of it is genuinely that the experience is unique and valuable in ways that are difficult to communicate to people who haven't lived it. The sense of mastery that comes from controlling a complex machine at its performance limits. The trust and bonds that develop when you're regularly trusting people with your life. The clarity of purpose that comes from a mission that's clearly defined and obviously important. The personal growth that results from being constantly tested and pushed beyond what you thought were your limits. There's research on what makes experiences meaningful and satisfying. And it consistently shows that people value challenge, autonomy, mastery, purpose, and relationships. And fighter aviation provides all of these in extreme doses. The challenge is obvious. You're doing one of the hardest jobs in the world. The autonomy is significant despite the military hierarchy. Because once you're in the air, you're making decisions independently, with life or death consequences. The mastery is profound. Becoming truly expert at this job takes years of continuous effort and improvement. The purpose is clear. You're defending your country, supporting your fellow warriors, part of something larger than yourself. And the relationships are deep, forged in shared hardship and danger, the kind of bonds that last a lifetime. So even though the job breaks your body and strains your relationships and exposes you to trauma and danger, it also provides experiences and relationships and personal growth that most people never access. And for those who value these things highly enough, the trade is worth it. This doesn't mean the job is for everyone. Most people couldn't handle it physically or psychologically, or wouldn't want to, even if they could, and that's fine. The world needs people doing many different things. But for those particular individuals who have the right combination of abilities and temperament and values, being a fighter pilot can be the most rewarding and meaningful career possible despite, or perhaps because of, how demanding and destructive it is. The question of whether you could survive a day as a fighter jet pilot is really several questions layered together. Could you physically survive it? As in, not die? Probably. If we're talking about a peacetime training mission and you're reasonably healthy, though you'd be exhausted and possibly injured and definitely humbled. Could you perform the job competently? Almost certainly not, because it takes years of training to develop the skills and knowledge required. And throwing an untrained person into a fighter cockpit would result in them being overwhelmed and dangerous to themselves and others. Could you handle it psychologically, the stress and the fear and the constant evaluation? Some people could and some couldn't, and you wouldn't really know until you tried. Could you sustain it as a career? doing this day after day for years. Very few people can, which is why fighter pilot positions are so selective and competitive. Because the military needs to identify the small percentage of people who have the physical abilities, mental capabilities, and psychological resilience to handle this job long term. So here's the final answer to the question of whether you'd survive a day as a fighter jet pilot, delivered with all the nuance and complexity it deserves. If we're talking about literal physical survival through one training mission, sure, but probably, assuming you're healthy enough to pass a flight physical and the mission doesn't involve actual combat and nothing goes mechanically wrong and you don't make any catastrophic errors, you'd likely survive. Though you'd be more physically and mentally exhausted than you've ever been, you'd probably vomit at some point. You might briefly lose consciousness from G-log despite your best efforts. And you'd almost certainly gain a profound respect for people who do this professionally. If we're talking about performing the job competently and safely, contributing to the mission rather than being a liability, completing tasks to standard rather than just surviving, then no. You absolutely couldn't do it without extensive training. And even with training, it would take months or years before you reached minimum proficiency. If we're talking about sustaining this as a career, handling the continuous physical punishment and psychological stress and relationship strain, maintaining performance while your body degrades and your hearing fails and your neck hurts constantly, staying sharp and focused when you're exhausted and stressed, continuing to show up and fly when friends have died and you know you could be next, then very few people can do it. And whether you're one of those few is something you can only discover by trying. The broader truth is that modern fighter aviation represents one of the most extreme examples of humans using technology to exceed our biological limitations, pushing our bodies and minds to perform in environments and situations that evolution never prepared us for. And the cost of doing this is significant and unavoidable. We've built machines that can pull maneuvers and reach speeds that would kill an unprotected human instantly. And we've developed equipment and techniques that let humans barely survive inside these machines. But barely surviving is different from thriving. And the human body keeps score of every insult and injury. The next generation of fighter aircraft, the sixth-generation systems being developed now, will be even more capable and demanding. With even higher performance envelopes, and there's serious discussion about whether human pilots will be able to handle them, or whether we've reached the limit of what a biological organism can do in a fighter aircraft. The alternative is autonomy or remote operation, taking the human out of the cockpit. And this raises profound questions about the ethics and tactics and strategy of warfare, about whether we want machines making kill decisions, about whether remote pilots thousands of miles from the battlefield feel the weight of their actions in the same way that pilots in cockpits do. But as of now, today, fighter pilots are still humans, still subject to all the limitations and fragilities of flesh and bone, still experiencing pain and fear and exhaustion, still making mistakes and learning from them, still forming relationships and building careers and dealing with consequences. They're humans doing something that seems superhuman, paying a price that's very human for reasons that are complex and personal and not always rational. So would you survive a day as a fighter jet pilot? Maybe. Would you want to? That depends on who you are and what you value and how you weigh intensity of experience against physical preservation, how much you need challenge and purpose versus safety and comfort. Whether you can accept the costs in exchange for the rewards. For most people, the answer is no. They'd rather not. They have different dreams and different tolerances and different priorities. And that's perfectly valid. But for that small percentage of people who have the right combination of abilities and temperament and values, who need what this career provides badly enough to pay what it costs, the answer is yes, absolutely yes. They'd survive it and embrace it and give everything to it. Because for them, there's nothing else that compares. No other experience that provides the same meaning and challenge and intensity. And they'll keep showing up and strapping in and pulling G's until their bodies won't let them anymore. And they'll consider it worth every bit of the price they paid. Let's dive deeper into the specific physical sensations you'd experience during that hypothetical day as a fighter pilot. Because understanding the theory is different from feeling it in your body. And your body would be screaming at you in ways you've never experienced. The G-suit inflation during your first hard turn would feel like someone wrapped boa constrictors around your legs and lower abdomen, and then commanded them to squeeze in perfect rhythm with your maneuvers, the bladders inflating with compressed air in milliseconds, creating pressure that's initially startling and then becomes your uncomfortable companion for the entire flight. Your first experience with sustained high G maneuvering would be revelatory and terrifying. The sensation of your face sagging downward as the skin and muscle are pulled by forces your skull structure can't fully resist. Your cheeks drooping, your vision narrowing as the blood drains from your retinas despite your anti-G straining. The tunnel vision starting at the periphery and creeping inward like someone slowly closing curtains around your field of view. And you're straining and grunting and clenching every muscle in your lower body. Doing the hook maneuver, where you're essentially giving yourself a hernia intentionally to spike your blood pressure. And still the gray out comes. And if you don't ease off the G's, you'll progress from gray out to blackout. From reduced vision to no vision. From conscious to unconscious. And you'll wake up seconds later with the aircraft in an unusual attitude and precious little altitude to recover. The buffeting when you approach a stall would feel like the aircraft is coming apart, the whole airframe shaking violently, the stick shaking in your hand, the stall warning tone screaming in your headset. And your training would tell you to release back pressure and lower the nose to regain airspeed. But your instincts would scream to pull back harder because you're pointed at the ground, and pulling back is how you climb. And fighting your instincts is exhausting and unnatural. The sustained noise level in the cockpit would be far louder than you expect. Even with your helmet providing some sound attenuation, the constant roar of airflow over the canopy, the whine of hydraulic pumps, the beeps and tones of various systems, all combining into an assault on your hearing that would leave your ears ringing for hours after landing. And this is with hearing protection. Without it, you'd suffer immediate and permanent hearing damage. The oxygen mask would create a constant low-level sensation of suffocating, each breath requiring slightly more effort than normal breathing. The rubber pressing against your face, leaving marks and pressure points, your face sweating underneath it with no way to wipe the sweat away. And periodically, you'd need to equalize the pressure in your ears as you change altitude, holding your nose through the mask and blowing, which is awkward and difficult. With all the equipment on your face, the helmet weight on your neck would be negligible during level flight, but would become crushing during high G maneuvers. That 4 to 6 pound helmet becoming 24 to 36 pounds of force, trying to snap your neck in whatever direction the G's are pulling. And you'd have to consciously keep your head aligned with your spine. Resist the urge to look around during hard maneuvering because turning your head under high G's is a great way to suffer acute neck injury. The temperature regulation in the cockpit would be imperfect. You'd be too hot during ground operations with the canopy closed and the sun beating down, sweating profusely into your flight suit, and then too cold at altitude when the environmental control system overcorrects, and then too hot again when you're working hard during maneuvering and your body is generating heat faster than the system can remove it, creating a cycle of thermal discomfort that adds to the general misery. The moment you'd realize you're completely out of your depth would probably come during your first simulated emergency. When an instructor pilot or the mission scenario throws a malfunction at you, and you're suddenly dealing with a critical system failure while also flying the aircraft, navigating and communicating, and your brain would simply lock up from task saturation, unable to process everything simultaneously. And you'd fumble through the emergency checklist while the aircraft does things you don't want it to do because you're not flying it properly while you're focused on the emergency. Real fighter pilots have trained to the point where emergency procedures are automatic, where they can handle engine fires or hydraulic failures or electrical problems while simultaneously conducting combat operations. But this level of automaticity takes thousands of hours of practice, and without it, you'd be overwhelmed by even simple emergencies. The spatial disorientation would be subtle and insidious, happening during a climb into clouds where you lose all external visual references, and suddenly your inner ear is absolutely convinced you're in a climbing right turn. And when the instruments show, you're actually in a descending left turn. And your body believes the inner ear, because that's what bodies do. And the instruments must be wrong, except the instruments are never wrong about this. And you'd have to force yourself to trust the gauges over your physical sensations. And this cognitive dissonance would be deeply unsettling. Your brain receiving contradictory information and having to consciously override its own sensory input. The fatigue would accumulate faster than you'd expect. Not just physical fatigue from the G-forces and the equipment weight, but mental fatigue from the constant high-stakes decision-making, the sustained alertness, the information processing, and this mental fatigue would make you sloppy, slow your reactions, degrade your judgment right when you need it most, creating a dangerous feedback loop where fatigue causes mistakes, which cause stress, which increases fatigue. Your hands would develop a tremor from the sustained muscle tension of gripping the stick and throttle, from fighting the control forces, from the adrenaline that's been flooding your system for hours. And you'd notice this tremor when you try to make fine adjustments to your flight path and the stick moves more than you intended because your hands aren't steady. The dehydration would manifest as headache and dry mouth and difficulty concentrating, your body running low on fluids from the sweating and from the dry cockpit air. And from the fact that you haven't drunk anything in hours, because drinking means having to urinate, and urinating in flight is complicated and embarrassing. And the dehydration would make everything harder, make you stupider and slower, and more prone to mistakes. The air sickness, if you're one of the unfortunate people susceptible to it, would be absolutely miserable. That queasy stomach feeling that builds during turbulence or aerobatic maneuvering. The cold sweat, the excessive salivation that precedes vomiting, and then the actual vomiting, which in a fighter cockpit means vomiting into your oxygen mask or trying to break the seal and vomit into a bag while maintaining aircraft control and not contaminating the cockpit with your stomach contents. And some people never adapt to the motion. Their bodies never stop rebelling against the unnatural movements. And these people can't be fighter pilots, no matter how good they are at everything else. The psychological pressure of knowing that mistakes have consequences would be unlike anything in civilian life, where most mistakes are reversible, or at least not fatal. But in a fighter aircraft, many mistakes kill you immediately or kill you shortly thereafter. And this knowledge would create a background stress level that never fully goes away, a constant awareness that you're operating in an unforgiving environment with no margin for error. The landing would be where everything you've struggled with during the flight would come to a head, because landing a fighter aircraft requires precise control and perfect timing and specific techniques. And you'd be attempting this while exhausted and dehydrated and mentally saturated and possibly airsick, with hands that shake and a neck that aches and vision that might be slightly degraded from the repeated high-G exposure. The approach would require you to maintain a specific airspeed and descent rate while compensating for wind and configuring the aircraft and running through checklists. And you'd be behind the aircraft, reacting to what it's doing rather than anticipating and preventing. And the runway would be approaching faster than seems possible, and you'd be making corrections that are too large and too late. Over-controlling, inducing oscillations in pitch and bank that make the approach unstable. The touchdown itself would ideally be gentle, a smooth transition from flight to ground roll. But yours would probably be firm at best and dangerous at worst, either floating too long and landing too far down the runway, or coming in too steep and hitting hard enough to potentially damage the landing gear, or bouncing back into the air because you didn't properly flare, or drifting off centerline because you're not coordinating your rudder and aileron inputs correctly. And if you somehow survived the landing without bending the aircraft, the taxi back would be its own challenge. Steering with your feet on the rudder pedals while also applying brakes and managing speed. And you'd probably weave all over the taxiway, because your fine motor control is degraded and you're trying to do too many things at once. The shutdown procedures would be a blur of switches you're flipping in roughly the right order while hoping you're not forgetting something critical. And when you finally shut down the engine and the systems go dark and quiet, you'd sit there for a moment in the sudden silence, and the adrenaline would start wearing off. And you'd realize just how completely exhausted you are. How much every part of your body hurts, how much your hands are shaking, how badly you need water and food and a bathroom and sleep. Climbing out of the cockpit would be difficult, your legs uncertain and weak, your body stiff from sitting in one position under tension for hours. And you'd probably need help disconnecting from the aircraft systems, help climbing down the ladder. And when your boots hit the tarmac, you'd feel like you just survived something you shouldn't have. And you'd be right. The post-flight briefing would be humbling, reviewing your performance and having every mistake cataloged and analyzed. And there would be many mistakes. From radio calls made incorrectly, to procedures executed poorly, to tactical decisions that made no sense, to safety violations you didn't even realize you were committing. And you'd sit there and take it, because there's no defending poor performance, no excusing mistakes that could have killed you or others. And this would be one flight, one training mission in peacetime, with an instructor pilot keeping you from killing yourself, with no one actually shooting at you, with the weather cooperative and the aircraft functioning normally and nothing truly going wrong. And you'd be destroyed by it, physically and mentally depleted, humbled and exhausted, and possibly questioning every decision that led you to this point. Now imagine doing this multiple times per week. Imagine doing it while someone's trying to kill you. Imagine doing it for years until your body breaks. And you start to understand what fighter pilots actually go through, what they actually sacrifice, what this career actually costs. Now let's talk about what happens when everything doesn't go according to plan. When you're not just dealing with the normal challenges of flying a fighter, but with actual emergencies that require immediate correct action or you die. Engine failure at altitude gives you options and time. You can attempt an air start following the emergency procedures. You can glide toward a suitable landing area. You have minutes to make decisions and execute plans. But engine failure during takeoff at low altitude gives you seconds. And the decision tree is simple and brutal. If you have runway remaining and you're below a certain speed, abort the takeoff and stop on the runway. If you're above that speed but below a certain altitude, eject immediately because you don't have enough energy to maneuver and can't land safely. If you're above that altitude, you might attempt to return to the runway, but probably you're ejecting because the risk of maneuvering at low altitude with no thrust is too high. The problem is that you have about 2 seconds to make this decision and execute it. And if you choose wrong or hesitate, you die. And the stress of making life or death decisions in seconds while the ground rushes up at you is something that no amount of simulator training fully prepares you for. Because in the simulator, you know it's not real. And your body knows it's not real, and the fear isn't real. But in the actual aircraft, with the actual engine failure at the actual low altitude, the fear is very real and very reasonable and potentially paralyzing. Hydraulic failure robs you of flight control authority. The stick becomes sluggish or unresponsive, and the aircraft has backup systems, but these backups provide degraded capability. And you're suddenly flying an aircraft that doesn't respond the way you expect, that requires different control inputs. And you need to immediately adapt your technique while also running emergency procedures and declaring an emergency and setting up for a precautionary landing, all while maintaining aircraft control with systems that are partially failed. Electrical failure means losing instruments and displays and communication equipment, flying on backup instruments if you're lucky, and trying to navigate back to base without GPS or radio navigation aids. Setting up for a landing without being able to talk to the tower, hoping that they see you and understand you're in an emergency and clear the runway, and don't send someone out to meet you head-on. Fire is the nightmare scenario, whether engine fire or cockpit fire or fuel fire. Because fires in aircraft tend to spread rapidly and compromise critical systems, and the emergency procedures are time critical. And if you can't extinguish the fire quickly, you're ejecting. And if the fire compromises the ejection system before you eject, then you're riding the aircraft down to impact. Bird strikes can happen at any altitude, but are most dangerous during takeoff and landing when you're low and slow. And a bird going through your engine intake at 200 knots can cause instant catastrophic engine failure. Or a bird hitting your canopy can shatter it and incapacitate you. And there's no avoiding birds if they're in your flight path because your closing speed is too high. You just hit them and deal with the consequences. Mid-air collisions are almost always fatal because the closing speeds and impact forces involved are massive. But there have been cases where aircraft collided and remained controllable enough for the pilots to eject or even land. And these cases are studied intensely because understanding what made survival possible in these edge cases might save lives in future incidents. The ejection sequence itself is worth understanding in detail because it's both your salvation and your punishment. A system designed to save your life while simultaneously destroying your body in controlled ways. The ejection decision is supposed to be made above a certain minimum altitude to give the parachute time to deploy. But in extremis, pilots have successfully ejected at 0 altitude and 0 airspeed. Rocket-powered ejection seats are that powerful. But the success rate of low-altitude ejections is significantly worse than high-altitude ejections because of the reduced time for the sequence to complete. When you pull the ejection handles, either the primary handles between your legs or the secondary handles above your head, you're initiating a precisely timed sequence of events that happens faster than you can consciously track. First, the canopy jettisons. Explosive charges shattering the locks and rockets blowing it clear of the aircraft. And you're exposed to the airstream, which at high speed can exceed 300 miles per hour of wind blast. And then, a fraction of a second later, the seat rockets fire. Solid rocket motors that produce massive thrust for a very short duration, accelerating you and the seat up the rails and clear of the aircraft at forces that peak around 14 Gs vertical. Your body experiences this as being hit from below by a giant hammer. Your spine compresses, your vertebrae squeeze together. And if you're not in the correct position, back against the seat, head against the headrest, this force can cause severe injuries, including spinal fractures. The seat separates from you at altitude, the parachute deploys automatically, and you're suddenly falling at a much slower rate, suspended under a canopy. And if you're conscious and uninjured, you're assessing your situation, looking for the best landing area, trying to steer the parachute if you have steerable reserves, preparing for landing. The parachute landing itself is violent. You're falling at about 20 feet per second when you hit the ground, equivalent to jumping off a 2-story building. And the landing training teaches you to hit and roll to distribute the impact. But if you land wrong, or land on rocks, or land in water with all your gear on, you can be injured or killed by the landing itself. If you ejected over hostile territory, the moment you land, you're a high-value target, an enemy pilot alone and likely injured in enemy territory. And you need to immediately activate your survival radio, find cover, administer first aid to yourself, and evade capture until rescue forces can reach you. And this survival scenario is what all that survival training was for. The SEER training, Survival Evasion Resistance Escape, where they teach you how to survive behind enemy lines and resist interrogation if captured. If you ejected over water, you're dealing with drowning risk from the parachute dragging you if you can't release it quickly, from the weight of all your gear trying to pull you under, from hypothermia if the water is cold, from sharks if you're bleeding, and water survival after ejection has its own set of challenges and risks. If you ejected over friendly territory or over the ocean near friendly ships, your survival radio brings rescue forces who will pick you up, get you medical treatment, and return you to your unit. And after medical evaluation, you'll be grounded temporarily while they assess whether you can return to flight status or whether the ejection injuries are career-ending. And many ejections are career-ending even when they're successful, because the spinal compression and other injuries are severe enough that you can't pass the flight physical anymore. The weapon systems that fighter pilots employ deserve detailed discussion because understanding what these aircraft can do helps understand what pilots must master. And the complexity is staggering. The AIM-120 AMRAAM is an active radar homing missile, meaning it has its own radar seeker that locks onto targets, and employing it correctly requires understanding radar modes, target sorting, launch zones, no escape zones, probability of kill calculations, and countermeasure defeat techniques. You need to know at what range to launch, based on target aspect and altitude and speed. You need to know how to maximize probability of hit while minimizing your own exposure to enemy missiles. You need to understand data link updates where your aircraft sends course corrections to the missile in flight. And you need to know when to go active, when to switch the missile to its own internal seeker versus maintaining guidance from the launching aircraft. The AIM-9 Sidewinder has evolved through multiple variants from the early heat-seeking missiles that could only lock onto hot engine exhaust from behind, to modern versions like the AIM-9X that can lock onto targets from any aspect, can target aircraft from the front or side or bottom, can engage targets that are actually behind you using helmet-mounted cueing systems where you look at the target and the missile locks onto whatever you're looking at. Operating the 9X requires understanding its envelope, knowing when you're in range and in parameters for a shot, understanding how to employ it in conjunction with the gun or with AMRAAMs in a fluid combat environment where you might be engaging multiple targets with multiple weapons types. The 20mm M61 Vulcan cannon is a last resort weapon, a 6-barrel Gatling-style rotary cannon that fires at 6,000 rounds per minute when active. But you only have about 500 rounds total, which means you have about 5 seconds of trigger time, 5 one-second bursts. And every round you fire is a round you don't have for the next engagement. So trigger discipline is critical. The ballistics are complex. The rounds are affected by gravity and wind, and your aircraft's speed and the target speed. And the lead computing site helps calculate the correct aim point. But you still need to understand the fundamentals of aerial gunnery. Understand deflection shooting and lead pursuit and lag pursuit. Understand how to get your pipper on the target at the right range with the right closure rate. Air-to-ground weapons are their own universe of complexity. From laser-guided bombs that require you or another aircraft to designate the target with a laser throughout the weapon's flight, to GPS-guided JDAMs that can be dropped in any weather and will guide themselves to programmed coordinates, to anti-armor weapons like the AGM-65 Maverick with its imaging infrared seeker that lets you see and designate targets from miles away. Each weapon type has its own employment procedures, its own minimum and maximum release altitudes and speeds, its own delivery profiles. And you need to know all of this for every weapon type you might carry. And the weapons load on any given mission might include multiple types with different employment requirements. The mission planning process that happens before every flight is intensive and critical because the pre-flight planning largely determines mission success or failure. And inadequate planning gets people killed. A complex strike mission might require 8 to 12 hours of planning for a 2-hour flight. And this planning involves studying target intelligence, analyzing threats, calculating fuel requirements, planning routes that avoid or minimize threat exposure, coordinating with other aircraft and support assets, filing flight plans, getting weather briefings, and creating backup plans for various contingencies. The target study involves understanding not just where the target is, but what it is, why it's important, what's around it, what defenses protect it, what collateral damage concerns exist, what weapons are appropriate for this specific target, and what constitutes successful target destruction versus inadequate damage. The threat analysis requires understanding what surface-to-air missile systems are in the area, what their capabilities are, what their engagement envelopes look like, where they're positioned, whether they're mobile or fixed, what their radar signatures are so you can identify them on your radar warning receiver, and how to avoid them or suppress them or survive them if avoidance isn't possible. The fuel planning is complex mathematics, calculating fuel burn rates at different altitudes and speeds, accounting for combat maneuvering, which burns fuel at much higher rates than cruise flight, planning for tanker rendezvous, ensuring you have enough fuel to reach the target, accomplish the mission, deal with contingencies, and return to base or divert to an alternate. And if your fuel calculations are wrong, you might find yourself in enemy territory with insufficient fuel to get home, which means ejecting or attempting a risky emergency landing. The route planning involves choosing ingress and egress routes that minimize threat exposure while accomplishing other objectives. And these routes are often indirect and complex, using terrain masking where you fly low behind hills to hide from radar, using electronic warfare aircraft that jam enemy radars, timing your arrival to coincide with other strikes that distract enemy defenses, and coordinating with refueling tankers positioned along your route. The backup planning involves thinking through what could go wrong and having plans for those contingencies, alternate targets if the primary is obscured or too heavily defended, alternate tankers if your primary tanker is unavailable, alternate recovery bases if your home field is weathered in, lost communications procedures if your radio fails, and rejoin procedures if you get separated from your flight. The formal mission brief brings all the participants together and walks through the entire mission in detail. Everyone understanding their role, the timeline, the frequencies, the code words, the weapons loadouts, the formations, the contingencies, and this brief can last hours, going through every aspect of the mission until everyone has a complete mental picture of how it should unfold. And after all this planning, the mission rarely goes exactly as planned, and the ability to adapt and improvise becomes as important as the planning itself, because the enemy gets a vote, weather changes, equipment fails, and pilots need to make real-time decisions based on the situation as it actually exists rather than as they planned for it to exist. The communication procedures in fighter aviation are precise and formalized because unclear communication gets people killed, and the radio frequencies are crowded and time is limited and clarity is essential. Each pilot has a call sign that identifies them on the radio, usually embarrassing as we've discussed. And you use these call signs in all radio communications, never real names, both for operational security and for clarity in the radio environment. The communication is structured and minimal, using standard phraseology that conveys maximum information in minimum words. And deviating from this phraseology causes confusion and wastes time and creates safety issues. A typical radio call might be, Viper 2, tally 1 bandit, north 10 miles, low, which tells your flight lead that you, Viper 2, have visual contact with one enemy aircraft 10 miles to the north at low altitude. And this 13-word transmission conveys critical tactical information that everyone on the frequency needs to know. The radio discipline requires you to listen as much as you talk, to process information from multiple sources simultaneously, to remember who said what and when, to build a mental picture of the tactical situation from fragmentary radio calls, and to make your own calls at appropriate times without stepping on other transmissions. The lost communications procedures are essential because radios fail, and you need to be able to continue the mission or safely recover without radio contact using visual signals and pre-briefed procedures and standardized patterns that everyone knows. The emergency frequencies are monitored by rescue forces and other aircraft, And if you're in an emergency, you switch to guard frequency, the universal emergency channel, and declare your emergency. And everyone listening knows to clear the frequency and render assistance. The secure communications use encrypted radios that prevent the enemy from listening to your transmissions. But these systems add complexity and can fail. And you need to be able to operate on both secure and unsecure frequencies, depending on the situation and the sensitivity of the information being transmitted. The multi-ship coordination requires constant communication between flight members, calling out threats and targets and positions, maintaining situational awareness of where everyone is and what everyone's doing. Avoiding friendly fire incidents, which are a real risk when multiple aircraft are operating in the same airspace with similar capabilities. The air-to-ground coordination with forward air controllers or joint terminal attack controllers on the ground requires a different communication style, more detailed, more deliberate, confirming target locations and friendly positions and weapons to be employed, going through a 9-line brief that specifies exactly what you're going to attack and how and when, and reading back the critical elements to confirm understanding. Because mistakes in close air support can result in fratricide, in killing friendly forces, which is about the worst thing that can happen in combat. The communication with air traffic control for takeoff and landing clearances follows civil aviation procedures mostly, but with military-specific elements. And controllers need to know if you're an emergency aircraft, if you're a formation, if you have special requirements, and you need to listen to their instructions and comply precisely because other aircraft are operating in the same airspace and deviations cause conflicts and collisions. The cultural aspects of fighter squadrons are unique and important because the squadron becomes your family and your identity and your support system. And understanding this culture helps understand why people stay in this job despite the costs. The fighter pilot persona that exists in popular culture is both accurate and misleading. There's certainly confidence bordering on arrogance, because you need that confidence to do this job. You need to believe you can handle anything that comes up, or you'll hesitate at critical moments. But there's also genuine humility born from being constantly evaluated and frequently humbled by the difficulty of the job and the skill of your peers. The call sign tradition is a microcosm of the culture. You don't choose your call sign. The squadron gives it to you, usually based on some mistake or embarrassing incident, and it sticks with you forever. And this tradition serves multiple purposes. It's a form of hazing that integrates new members. It's a humility check that prevents anyone from taking themselves too seriously. And it's a bonding mechanism where everyone has been similarly embarrassed. The squadron bar, or ready room, is where the culture lives, where pilots gather after flights to debrief informally, to tell stories, to maintain the oral tradition of tactics and techniques and lessons learned. And alcohol is often involved because fighter pilots historically have had complex relationships with alcohol, using it to decompress from the stress, to self-medicate for pain or sleep problems, sometimes to excess in ways that become problematic. The sense of humor is dark and often inappropriate by civilian standards. Jokes about death and danger and violence that would horrify outsiders, but that serve as coping mechanisms, ways of processing the constant exposure to mortality and violence, ways of maintaining psychological distance from the reality of what you do. The pranks and practical jokes are elaborate and ongoing, a form of entertainment and stress relief and status competition. And new members are particularly targeted as part of the integration process. And these pranks can be funny or mean or both depending on your perspective and your position in the hierarchy. The heritage and tradition are deeply important. Squadrons have histories going back decades, combat records and famous members and distinctive patches and mottos. And new members are expected to learn this history, to understand they're part of a continuum, to respect those who came before while adding to the legacy themselves. The meritocracy is real. Performance matters more than almost anything else. You're judged on your flying skills and your tactical proficiency and your performance under pressure, not on your background or your connections. And this creates a culture where competence is respected and incompetence is not tolerated, regardless of rank or seniority. The mutual dependence creates bonds that are difficult to describe to outsiders. When you're regularly trusting people with your life, and they're trusting you with theirs. When you're operating at high stress and high stakes together. The relationships that form are different from normal friendships or normal professional relationships. Deeper and more intense and sometimes more important than family relationships. The transition out of this culture when you leave the squadron or leave the service is difficult, because civilian life doesn't provide the same intensity of relationships or the same level of purpose or the same degree of challenge. And many former fighter pilots struggle to find communities and relationships that match what they had in the squadron. The final assessment of whether you could survive as a fighter pilot needs to account for all the dimensions we've explored. The physical punishment that accumulates with every flight and compounds over a career. The mental demands of processing massive amounts of information while making life or death decisions in seconds. The psychological toll of constant evaluation and exposure to danger and loss of friends. The relationship costs of being gone constantly and being emotionally unavailable when present. The identity issues that arise when this job becomes your entire sense of self, and the long-term consequences that follow you for the rest of your life in the form of chronic pain and hearing loss and emotional scars. For the hypothetical one-day experience, you'd survive in the sense that you probably wouldn't die during a peacetime training mission, but you'd be physically destroyed, mentally overwhelmed, and thoroughly humbled, understanding in your bones that this job is far harder and more demanding than you imagined. That the people who do it professionally are operating at a level you can't reach without years of dedicated training and personal sacrifice. For the hypothetical career, the question isn't really whether you could survive. It's whether you should. Whether the rewards justify the costs, whether the intensity and purpose and challenge are worth the physical destruction and relationship damage and psychological toll. And this calculation is deeply personal and depends on your values and your alternatives and your tolerance for pain and danger and sacrifice. Some people are suited for this career. They have the physical capabilities and mental resilience and personality traits that let them not just survive, but thrive in this environment. And for these people, being a fighter pilot is the best possible use of their abilities and the most fulfilling career they could imagine despite the costs. Other people could potentially develop the skills to fly fighters, but would be miserable doing it. Would find the costs unacceptable, would burn out or break down. And for these people, pursuing this career would be a mistake, even if they could physically and mentally handle the job. The modern military has gotten better at identifying and supporting pilots who are struggling, better mental health resources, better acknowledgement of the physical toll, better support for families. But the fundamental nature of the job hasn't changed and can't change because the physics and the mission requirements are what they are. Flying a fighter aircraft will always be physically punishing. Combat will always be psychologically traumatic. And the operational tempo will always strain relationships. And no amount of support can fully eliminate these costs. Only help people manage them. The future of fighter aviation is uncertain. Unmanned systems and artificial intelligence are advancing rapidly. And there may come a time when human pilots are no longer necessary or optimal for this mission. When machines can outperform humans without suffering the physical and psychological costs that humans endure. And this might be a positive development, reducing casualties and expanding capabilities. Or it might represent a loss of something important, the human judgment and adaptability and moral weight that humans bring to combat decisions. But for now, and for the foreseeable future, fighter pilots are humans, flesh and blood people doing an inhuman job, paying a very human price for reasons that make sense to them even if they seem crazy to everyone else. And understanding what they go through, what they sacrifice, what this career actually costs, gives you perspective on both the nobility of the sacrifice and the tragedy of its necessity. Let's examine the specific physiological adaptations that happen to fighter pilots' bodies over time. Because the human organism does attempt to adapt to the extreme stresses it's subjected to, though these adaptations are incomplete and come with their own costs. The cardiovascular system develops increased tolerance to G-forces through regular exposure. The body learns to more efficiently redistribute blood during high G maneuvering. The autonomic nervous system becomes more responsive to the need to maintain cerebral blood pressure. And experienced pilots can sustain higher G loads for longer periods than novices. But this adaptation has limits, and the cardiovascular strain still causes cumulative damage over years. The muscular system develops specific strength patterns, neck muscles hypertrophy from constantly supporting the helmet weight under G loading, core muscles strengthen from the anti-G straining maneuver. But these adaptations create muscular imbalances that contribute to chronic pain and postural problems. The vestibular system, your inner ear balance mechanism, becomes somewhat desensitized to unusual motion through repeated exposure. Experienced pilots are less susceptible to motion sickness and spatial disorientation than beginners. But this desensitization never becomes complete and can be overwhelmed by extreme or prolonged, unusual attitudes. The visual system adapts to rapid focus changes between cockpit instruments and distant targets, developing faster accommodation reflexes, but the constant strain still leads to progressive vision degradation in many pilots. The endocrine system shows chronic elevation of stress hormones, cortisol, and adrenaline levels that remain higher than normal even during non-flying periods. And this chronic stress hormone exposure contributes to various health problems, including cardiovascular disease, metabolic issues, and immune system suppression. The sleep architecture changes. Pilots develop fragmented sleep patterns from years of irregular schedules and high-stress operations. Deep sleep phases become shorter and less restorative. And this sleep disruption has cascading effects on physical and mental health. The hearing threshold shifts from chronic noise exposure. Even with the best hearing protection, you're still exposed to damaging sound levels. And the cumulative effect is progressive high-frequency hearing loss and tinnitus that worsens over the career. The skeletal system shows accelerated degeneration. particularly in the cervical spine and lumbar spine, where the combination of compression forces and awkward loading patterns causes disc degeneration and vertebral changes that are visible on imaging and that cause chronic pain. The question of whether these physiological changes represent adaptation or damage is complex because they're both. The body does adapt to allow continued function under extreme stress. But these adaptations come at the cost of long-term health and quality of life. Medical research on fighter pilot physiology has led to improvements in equipment and techniques. Better G-suits that provide more effective counterpressure. Better helmet designs that reduce weight and improve balance. Better seat cushions that reduce spinal loading. Better oxygen systems that reduce breathing effort. But despite these improvements, the fundamental stresses remain because the physics of high-performance flight haven't changed. The long-term health outcomes for fighter pilots show elevated rates of certain conditions. Chronic musculoskeletal pain is nearly universal. Hearing loss is extremely common. Cardiovascular disease rates are elevated, possibly due to chronic stress. And certain cancers show higher incidence, though the causal mechanisms aren't fully understood. The military provides disability compensation for service-connected health problems, and fighter pilots retire with disability ratings for neck problems and back problems and hearing loss and other conditions that are direct results of their service. And this compensation acknowledges that the job causes predictable, preventable harm that we accept because the mission is deemed important enough to justify it. The training evolution that produces combat-ready fighter pilots is a multi-year pipeline with multiple failure points. And understanding this timeline helps appreciate the investment required to create a single operational fighter pilot. From the decision to join the military to first operational assignment typically takes 5 to 7 years, starting with 4 years at the Air Force Academy or Officer Training School. Then approximately 18 months of initial and primary flight training. Then 6 to 12 months of advanced fighter training in the T-38. Then 6 to 12 months of fighter training unit in your assigned aircraft type. And only then do you arrive at your operational squadron as a barely qualified pilot who still needs years of experience to become truly proficient. The cost of producing a fighter pilot is staggering. Various estimates put it between $5 and $11 million per pilot by the time they complete all training and are mission ready. And this cost includes instructor time, aircraft operating costs, fuel, maintenance, ammunition, simulators, and all the other resources consumed during the training pipeline. The attrition throughout this pipeline is significant. Of 100 people who start with the dream of becoming fighter pilots, maybe 30 will actually make it through the complete pipeline to operational assignment. The rest washing out at various points for medical reasons, performance reasons, personal reasons, or simply deciding this isn't what they want. The commitment required from those who make it is substantial. Military service commitments for pilots typically run 10 years from completion of flight training, meaning you're obligated to serve for a decade after you finish training. And this commitment is necessary because the military has invested millions in your training and needs to recoup that investment through operational service. The opportunity cost for individuals is significant. Those years spent in military service with military pay and military constraints could have been spent building civilian careers with potentially much higher earnings. And the calculation of whether the experience is worth the opportunity cost depends on how you value money versus the unique experiences and challenges of military aviation. The comparison to civilian aviation training is stark. Becoming a commercial airline pilot requires maybe 2 years of training at a cost of $50,000 to $100,000 and results in a career with much better work-life balance and much higher pay and much less physical risk. And many military pilots eventually transition to airlines after fulfilling their service commitments, using their military training and experience as a pathway to civilian aviation careers. The question of why the military pipeline is so long and expensive has multiple answers. The complexity of modern fighter aircraft requires extensive training. The high stakes of combat operations demand thorough preparation. The military culture values comprehensive education over narrow technical training. And honestly, some of the pipeline length is traditional rather than strictly necessary. But attempts to shorten the pipeline risk reducing the quality and readiness of pilots, which could increase casualties in combat. The retention challenge facing the military is real. Training pilots is expensive and time-consuming. And losing experienced pilots to civilian airlines or other careers represents a significant loss of capability and investment. And the military struggles to retain pilots because civilian opportunities offer better pay and better lifestyle and less physical punishment. And various retention bonuses and incentives have limited effectiveness because money can't fully compensate for the costs of continued military service. The specific challenges of carrier-based fighter operations add an entirely new dimension of difficulty for naval aviators. Because landing on an aircraft carrier is objectively one of the hardest things a pilot can do. And doing it at night in bad weather is considered the most difficult routine aviation operation that exists. The carrier deck is moving, pitching, and rolling with the ocean swells. And it's small, about 600 feet of usable landing area, compared to thousands of feet of runway ashore. And you're approaching at high speed because the aircraft needs to maintain flying speed. And you're aiming for a tiny section of that moving deck, specifically one of 4 arresting wires stretched across the deck. And you need to catch one of these wires with your tail hook to stop the aircraft because you don't have enough deck length to stop with brakes alone. The approach is controlled by the landing signal officer, an experienced pilot standing on the deck, giving you corrections, telling you if you're high or low, fast or slow, on center line or drifting, and you're making constant tiny corrections based on their calls and your own assessment of the approach. And when you touch down, you immediately go to full power because if your hook doesn't catch a wire, you need to take off again immediately, executing a bolter. And if you don't have power when you realize you've missed the wires, you'll roll off the end of the deck into the ocean. The night carrier landing is the same procedure, except you can't see anything. The deck is just a small patch of lights in vast darkness. Your depth perception is gone. Your visual references are minimal, and you're relying on instruments and the landing signal officer's calls and your training, and honestly, a lot of faith. And the stress level is astronomical because you're essentially landing on a postage stamp in the dark while the postage stamp moves. The carrier qualification process requires multiple successful daytime arrested landings, followed by multiple successful night landings before you're qualified, and the failure rate is significant. Some pilots simply can't master carrier landings and wash out to other assignments. The catapult launch from carriers is its own adventure. Your aircraft is connected to a steam catapult or electromagnetic catapult that will accelerate you from 0 to 160 miles per hour in about 2 seconds. And you salute the catapult officer. They launch you, and you go from stop to flying in a violent acceleration that pins you to your seat. And if the catapult fails, or if you have an engine problem during the launch, you're going into the water at high speed, and you need to eject immediately. The case recovery at night in bad weather, landing on a carrier at night in the rain or fog, is so difficult that it's genuinely dangerous even for experienced pilots. And accidents happen, aircraft missing the deck entirely, hitting the back of the ship, landing gear collapsing on touchdown, and pilots dying despite doing everything correctly, because sometimes the difficulty exceeds human capability and luck runs out. The comparison between Air Force and Navy fighter pilots involves good-natured rivalry and legitimate operational differences. Air Force pilots generally have longer runways and don't deal with carrier operations, but often have longer deployments to austere locations. Navy pilots have shorter deployments on carriers, but deal with the constant stress of carrier operations. And both communities respect the challenges the other faces while maintaining that their own mission is harder. The evolution of air combat tactics from World War I to present day shows both continuity and revolution. Certain fundamental principles remain unchanged, while technology has completely transformed the execution of those principles. The World War I concept of getting behind your opponent to shoot them down with your gun remains valid today. Position and energy management still matter. But now you can shoot from 40 miles away with missiles, and you're managing energy states at supersonic speeds while pulling 9 Gs instead of subsonic speeds, pulling maybe 4 Gs. The World War II developments of formation tactics, mutual support, and coordinated attacks by multiple aircraft remain central to modern doctrine. You still fight as a team rather than as individuals. But the formations are looser, and the coordination happens through data links and secure communications rather than just visual signals. The Korean War introduction of jet combat and high-speed tactics, the realization that speed and altitude provided advantages that could outweigh maneuverability, influences current thinking about energy management and engagement tactics. The Vietnam War hard lessons about beyond visual range combat and missile reliability. The discovery that early air-to-air missiles weren't as effective as predicted, and that close-range dogfighting skills were still essential, led to the establishment of fighter weapons schools like Top Gun and Red Flag, where these lessons were systematically taught. The Gulf War demonstration of stealth technology and precision weapons and information dominance showed what modern air power could accomplish against an outmatched opponent, but also created potentially false confidence about how easy air superiority would be against a near-peer adversary. The recent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan have involved mostly air-to-ground operations against insurgents with no air force and limited air defenses, creating a generation of pilots who are very good at close air support and precision strike, but who haven't experienced contested air-to-air combat. And there's concern about whether skills and institutional knowledge about air superiority fighting are degrading from lack of practice. The current great power competition with China and Russia is driving renewed focus on air-to-air combat skills and tactics because both countries have developed fifth-generation fighters and advanced air defense systems. And the assumption of American air superiority is no longer safe. The next war might involve fighting for air superiority against capable opponents rather than operating in permissive airspace. The tactical innovations continue, using data links to share targeting information between aircraft, employing electronic warfare aircraft to jam enemy systems, coordinating with satellite reconnaissance and cyber operations. integrating manned fighters with unmanned drones that can be sent into dangerous areas first, developing artificial intelligence to assist with target identification and weapons employment. And these innovations are changing how air combat is conducted, while the fundamental objective remains the same: destroy the enemy before they destroy you. The studying of air combat history is mandatory for fighter pilots because the lessons learned in past conflicts often apply to current operations. And understanding what worked and what didn't and why helps you make better decisions when lives depend on it. And the oral tradition of tactics and techniques passed from experienced pilots to new pilots remains crucial despite all our technological advances. The psychological preparation for combat is as important as the physical and technical training, because the mental game determines whether you execute effectively when people are trying to kill you, or whether you freeze or panic or make fatal mistakes. The stress inoculation training involves gradually exposing pilots to increasing levels of stress and complexity, so they develop coping mechanisms and maintain performance under pressure. Starting with simple emergency procedures in the simulator, progressing to complex multi-ship scenarios with multiple failures and threats, building up to the most stressful training scenarios possible short of actual combat. The combat mindset training teaches you to accept that you might die and to function effectively despite this knowledge, to make peace with mortality enough that fear doesn't paralyze you, to focus on the mission and the execution rather than on the danger. And this is fundamentally a mental discipline that some people develop naturally and others must consciously cultivate. The decision-making under pressure training uses scenarios where you have incomplete information and limited time and must make choices with life or death consequences, learning to gather the essential information quickly to make the best decision possible with what you know, to execute that decision fully rather than second-guessing, and to learn from the outcome regardless of whether you chose correctly. The fear management techniques vary by individual. Some pilots use mental rehearsal, visualizing scenarios and their responses before they happen. Some use breathing techniques to control physiological stress responses. Some use positive self-talk or focus phrases. Some rely on training and muscle memory to override fear. And effective pilots develop a toolkit of techniques that work for them personally. The compartmentalization skills are essential. The ability to focus completely on the mission while airborne and not think about home or relationships or anything outside the cockpit. And then the ability to switch off that combat focus when you land and not bring the stress and the violence home with you. Though this compartmentalization is imperfect and often breaks down over time. The post-traumatic growth research suggests that some people emerge from traumatic experiences with increased resilience and capability, having proven to themselves that they can handle extreme situations. But this growth often comes with costs in the form of emotional numbing or difficulty connecting with people who haven't experienced similar intensity. The unit cohesion serves as psychological protection, knowing that your squadron mates understand what you're going through because they're going through it too. Having people you can talk to who don't need explanations or context. Feeling part of a group that shares the burden. And this is why the squadron becomes so important and why leaving it is so difficult. The moral preparation for employing lethal force, for potentially killing people, is handled differently by different individuals and different cultures within the military. Some frame it purely as a job that needs doing. Some develop detailed justifications about defending their country and protecting innocents. some struggle with a moral weight throughout their careers. And the reality is that most fighter pilots in recent decades haven't actually had to kill anyone in air-to-air combat, because air-to-air kills are rare, though many have employed weapons against ground targets, which involves different moral considerations. The international fighter pilot community includes American allies and adversaries, and understanding the capabilities and cultures of other nations' fighter forces provides important context for the profession globally. The Israeli Air Force is consistently ranked among the most capable in the world despite Israel's small size, with combat experienced pilots who have seen more actual air-to-air combat than most other air forces, flying American-made F-15s and F-16s and indigenous aircraft. And their tactics and techniques are studied by other air forces because they're proven in actual combat. The Russian fighter pilot tradition emphasizes different skills than Western air forces, with more focus on individual aerobatic ability and aircraft handling at extreme angles of attack. Flying aircraft like the Su-35 and Su-57 that are designed for post-stall maneuvering. Though questions exist about how well Russian training translates to modern combat scenarios, given their limited operational experience against capable opponents. The Chinese People's Liberation Army Air Force has rapidly modernized over the past 2 decades, developing indigenous 5th-generation fighters like the J-20, expanding their pilot training programs, and learning from observation of Western tactics. Though they lack combat experience, and questions remain about the quality of their training and the effectiveness of their tactics in actual combat. The European air forces, including the Royal Air Force, French Air Force, and German Luftwaffe, maintain high training standards and operate capable aircraft like the Eurofighter Typhoon and Rafale. And they regularly train with American forces in exercises that allow comparison and learning across nations. The adversary air training units, including American aggressor squadrons and contract adversary services, employ pilots specifically trained to replicate enemy tactics, flying against operational squadrons to provide realistic training. And these adversary pilots develop deep expertise in threat tactics and are crucial to preparing fighter pilots for actual combat. The exchange pilot programs allow pilots from allied nations to serve with each other's air forces, American pilots flying with British or Australian squadrons, and vice versa. Learning different perspectives and tactics and building international relationships that benefit coalition operations. The competition aspect exists through events like weapons competitions where squadrons from different nations compete in tactical scenarios. Though these competitions are friendly and focused on learning rather than definitive rankings. And they provide opportunities to observe different approaches to similar problems. The cultural differences in how different nations approach fighter aviation are significant. Americans tend toward systematic processes and technological solutions. Israelis toward aggressive tactics and initiative. Europeans toward balanced approaches emphasizing both technology and pilot skill. Russians toward aircraft performance and pilot ability to exploit that performance. And these different cultures produce different strengths and weaknesses that become apparent in coalition operations or competitions. The future of international fighter aviation involves increasing cooperation among allies through shared aircraft programs like the F-35, which multiple nations operate, combined training and operations, and shared development of tactics and techniques, while simultaneously involving competition with adversaries who are rapidly advancing their own capabilities and who study Western tactics to develop counters. The women in fighter aviation deserve specific discussion because their integration into this male-dominated field has been relatively recent and has faced significant challenges while producing outstanding pilots who have proven that gender is irrelevant to flying ability. The first American women fighter pilots were not allowed into combat aircraft until 1993, when the combat exclusion policy was lifted, meaning the entire history of women flying fighters operationally is only about 3 decades old. And the pioneers who broke this barrier faced not just the normal challenges of becoming fighter pilots, but additional scrutiny and skepticism, and sometimes hostility from those who didn't believe women belonged in fighters. The physiological differences between male and female pilots are minor and don't significantly affect flying ability. Women, on average, are smaller, which can actually be an advantage in the cramped fighter cockpit. G-tolerance is individual rather than gender-based, with some women tolerating high Gs better than some men. And equipment that was initially designed for male body proportions has been adapted to fit a wider range of body types. The pregnancy question is addressed through policies that ground pilots when they become pregnant for the safety of the fetus, but allow return to flying after childbirth once medically cleared. And female pilots must balance career timing with family planning in ways that male pilots don't face, though both genders struggle with the work-life balance challenges of this career. The performance data shows no significant gender difference in flying ability or tactical proficiency. Women fighter pilots graduate from training at similar rates as men, perform similarly in combat operations, and rise to leadership positions based on merit and arguments that women couldn't handle. The physical or mental demands have been definitively disproven by decades of operational experience. The cultural integration has been gradual and incomplete. Early female fighter pilots often describe being treated differently or having to prove themselves more than their male counterparts. But as more women enter the field and prove their capability, acceptance has increased and the novelty has decreased. And younger male pilots who grew up with women in all roles are generally more accepting than older generations. The harassment and discrimination issues that have plagued military aviation are not unique to fighter aviation, but affect women in fighters as they affect women throughout the military. And while policies and training have improved, cultural change is slow and problems persist in some units. The role model effect of successful women fighter pilots inspires more women to pursue this career, creating a positive feedback loop where increased representation leads to increased acceptance, leads to increased representation. And currently, about 5 to 7% of fighter pilots are women, a number that's growing but still represents significant underrepresentation. The question of physical standards and whether they should be adjusted for gender differences is contentious. Current policy maintains gender-neutral standards for pilots because the aircraft and the mission don't care about the pilot's gender. And lowering standards would undermine the credibility of all pilots regardless of gender. But ensuring that standards are truly job-related rather than arbitrary is important. The future likely involves continued gradual increase in female representation in fighter aviation, as cultural barriers continue to erode and as more women see this career as a viable option. And the long-term outcome will be fighter aviation that draws from the full talent pool of the population rather than half of it. The ejection seat technology that saves pilots' lives is a marvel of engineering that's been continuously refined over decades. And understanding how it works provides appreciation for the violence and precision required to save a life in milliseconds. The Martin Baker ejection seats, used in many fighter aircraft worldwide, have saved over 7,600 lives since their introduction. Each save documented and studied to improve future designs. And this record of success is built on thousands of engineering hours and test firings, and unfortunately, some failures that taught hard lessons. The ACES two-seat, used in American fighters like the F-15 and F-16, is a 0-0 seat, meaning it can successfully eject a pilot at 0 altitude and 0 airspeed, though barely. The rockets provide just enough thrust, and the parachute deploys just fast enough that you survive hitting the ground, but with minimal margin for error. The ejection sequence timing is critical and happens faster than human reaction time. When you pull the handle, you're initiating a pre-programmed sequence, where explosive charges and mechanical linkages execute a precise series of events. Canopy jettison occurs in the first quarter second. Seat rocket ignition happens about half a second later. Seat man separation and parachute deployment happen within 2 seconds. And the whole sequence from handle pull to parachute inflation is about 3 seconds if everything works correctly. The seat survival kit contains emergency equipment that deploys with the seat. A life raft if you're over water, survival radio, first aid kit, signal flares, and basic survival gear. Everything packed into the seat pan beneath you throughout the flight. And this equipment has saved pilots who ejected over hostile territory or water and survived the ejection, but still faced survival challenges. The ejection envelope defines the conditions under which ejection is survivable. Too low, and the parachute won't have time to deploy. Too fast, and the wind blast will kill you or cause catastrophic injuries. Inverted or in unusual attitudes, and the seat trajectory might send you into the ground. And pilots are taught these envelope limits so they can make informed decisions about when to eject versus when to attempt to save the aircraft. The injury statistics from ejection show that spinal compression injuries are common, occurring in about 30 to 40% of ejections. Other injuries include flail injuries from limbs hitting the airframe during ejection, wind blast injuries from exposure to extreme airflow, and landing injuries from parachute landing. And while most pilots survive ejection, many end their flying careers due to injuries sustained. The decision calculus for ejection involves weighing the risk of staying with a damaged aircraft against the risk of ejection injuries and exposure to enemy fire or environmental hazards if you eject over hostile territory or water. And this decision must often be made in seconds with incomplete information. And choosing wrong in either direction can be fatal. The testing of ejection seats uses anthropomorphic test dummies equipped with sensors to measure the forces and accelerations experienced during ejection. And human testing is limited to carefully controlled conditions because the risks are significant even in test scenarios. And the engineering margins are calculated to protect pilots across a wide range of body sizes and weights and ejection conditions. The maintenance of ejection seats is treated with extreme care. Special tools are required. Only qualified technicians can work on them. Explosive components are tracked and inspected regularly. And the consequences of improper maintenance are severe, because a seat that doesn't fire when needed means a dead pilot, and a seat that fires accidentally means injuries and aircraft damage. The future of fighter aviation involves technological developments that are happening now and conceptual systems that might emerge in the coming decades. And understanding these trends helps understand where this profession is heading and whether human pilots will remain central to air combat. The sixth-generation fighter programs currently under development by the United States and other nations represent evolutionary advances over fifth-generation aircraft, incorporating more advanced stealth, longer range, more powerful sensors and weapons, and increased networking capability. But these programs still assume a human pilot in the cockpit, even as they explore options for optional manning where the same airframe could operate with or without a pilot depending on the mission. The loyal wingman concept involves manned fighters controlling multiple unmanned aircraft that can perform dangerous missions, draw enemy fire, carry additional weapons, extend sensor coverage, essentially multiplying the capability of each manned fighter by giving them robotic teammates that can be risked in ways that you wouldn't risk a human pilot. The artificial intelligence in air combat is advancing rapidly. AI systems can already outperform human pilots in simulated dogfights under controlled conditions, learning tactics faster and executing maneuvers more precisely than humans. But these systems still struggle with the unexpected, with scenarios they weren't trained for, with the kind of creative problem-solving and ethical judgment that humans provide. The hypersonic weapons traveling at Mach 5 or faster change the timeline of air combat because defensive reaction times become impossibly short. Detecting a hypersonic missile and executing countermeasures might need to be automated because human decision loops are too slow. And this raises questions about delegating life or death decisions to algorithms. The directed energy weapons, including lasers and high-power microwave systems, offer the possibility of defensive systems that can engage multiple targets at the speed of light, with effectively unlimited ammunition as long as you have electrical power, potentially changing the calculus of missile defense and making current weapons less effective. The space-based systems, including satellite reconnaissance and communication and potentially space-based weapons, create a vertical dimension to air combat where control of space becomes as important as control of air. And fighter pilots might need to understand orbital mechanics and space-based threats as part of their tactical knowledge. The cyber warfare dimension means that air combat might be won or lost through hacking enemy systems, spoofing their sensors, jamming their communications, taking control of their weapons. And pilots need to understand this electronic and cyber battlespace as thoroughly as they understand physical airspace. The question of whether human pilots remain necessary has no certain answer. There are strong arguments for continued human presence, including the moral authority of human judgment in kill decisions, the flexibility and creativity that humans provide, the diplomatic and strategic implications of risking human lives. But there are also strong arguments for unmanned systems, including their ability to exceed human physical limits, their expendability in high-risk missions, and their potential cost advantages. The most likely outcome is a hybrid force structure, where some missions are flown by manned aircraft with human pilots making critical decisions, while other missions are flown by unmanned systems operating autonomously or under remote human control. And fighter pilots might evolve into mission commanders controlling teams of manned and unmanned assets rather than just flying individual aircraft. The skills that will remain valuable regardless of technological changes include tactical thinking, decision-making under uncertainty, leadership, and the ability to adapt to unexpected situations. And these fundamentally human capabilities will remain relevant even as the specific technical skills required change with advancing technology. So we return to the original question with all the context and detail and honesty that it deserves. Would you survive a day as a fighter jet pilot? And the answer is layered and complex, and deeply personal. In the most literal sense, if we placed you in a fighter cockpit with an instructor pilot and conducted a single peacetime training mission, you would probably survive the day. Though you would be physically destroyed, mentally overwhelmed, and thoroughly humbled by the experience, understanding viscerally that what looked exciting from the outside is actually brutal and demanding and harder than almost anything you've experienced. You would survive, but you wouldn't perform. You'd be a passenger more than a pilot, struggling to keep up with the aircraft and the situation, making mistakes continuously, learning how much you don't know and how far you are from competence. If we're asking whether you could develop the capability to actually do this job, whether you could complete the training pipeline and become an operational fighter pilot, the answer is maybe. Depending on your physical capabilities, your mental abilities, your tolerance for stress and pain, your willingness to sacrifice everything else in your life for this singular purpose. And frankly, on luck, because talented people wash out for reasons beyond their control. And sometimes lesser talents succeed through persistence or good timing. The real question isn't whether you could survive, but whether you should try. Whether the costs are acceptable for the rewards, whether this particular form of intensity and challenge and sacrifice aligns with your values and your life goals. For some people, becoming a fighter pilot would be the greatest achievement and most fulfilling experience of their life, worth every bit of the physical punishment and relationship strain and opportunity cost. Because the intensity of the experience and the depth of the relationships and the clarity of purpose provide meaning that nothing else could match. For other people, pursuing this career would be a mistake, sacrificing health and relationships and alternative opportunities for a job that doesn't align with their actual values once they understand what it really involves. Chasing a romanticized idea rather than engaging with the difficult reality. The honest assessment is that fighter pilots are not superheroes or inherently special people. They're individuals who have a specific set of abilities and tolerances, and who choose to develop those abilities through years of dedicated training, and who accept the costs that come with the job. And many people could potentially do it if they wanted to badly enough and were willing to pay the price. But most people, when they really understand the price, decide they don't want to pay it. And that's a completely rational decision. The profession exists because air power is strategically important, and fighter aircraft are effective tools of national power, and someone needs to fly them. And the people who choose this profession deserve respect for their sacrifice and dedication, while also deserving honesty about the costs they're paying. And potential future fighter pilots deserve accurate information about what they're getting into, rather than romanticized nonsense about glory and heroism. The technology will continue advancing. The aircraft will become more capable. The missions will evolve. But as long as there are human pilots in fighter cockpits, those humans will experience G-forces that compress their spines and damage their necks. We'll breathe through oxygen masks that make every breath slightly difficult. We'll sacrifice relationships and health and normalcy for this career. We'll face the possibility of dying in training or combat. And we'll make that sacrifice because they've decided it's worth it for reasons that make sense to them. So would you survive a day as a fighter jet pilot? Physically, probably. Psychologically, maybe. But the better question is whether you'd want to survive a career as a fighter pilot, whether you'd want to pay the price that this job demands, Whether you choose intensity and challenge and sacrifice over comfort and stability and longevity. And that's a question only you can answer once you truly understand what's being asked of you. And now, having read all of this, having explored every aspect of what this career actually involves, you have the information you need to answer honestly.